Hi, and welcome to Hi, and welcome to our presentation. Today we're going to talk about two conflicts that recently had a strong piece of momentum added to them. One is the Iran versus Israel war, and the other is the Ukraine versus Russia war. Now, of course, the Ukraine versus Russia war has been an ongoing conflict since 2022, but as Aaron is going to explain, there's been a huge shift in the politics over the last few months between the election of the current US president, between the acquisition of certain munitions and Ukrainian development of their own munitions, and of course the expansion of the war onto sovereign Russian territory in a much bigger way than previously has occurred. So that war, of course, changed quite noticeably, and the Israel versus Iran war has started in earnest now. So the rules, for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. Aaron and I are lay people, and we are trying to present what we find interesting or compelling. We're going to try and do it from a secular perspective, try to give it from an unbiased perspective. Of course, we come to this with our own biases, but we're going to try and do this from an analytical, secular perspective. Please be respectful. Of course, these are difficult topics. We love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. We'll also have an open mic at the end of the 2 hours that you can ask your questions or otherwise. But if you put them in the chat, we will respond in real time. I like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, we'll tell you enough to catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you know something, we'll probably still tell you things you didn't know. After 2 hours, we're going to do a hard stop on the actual presentation and, as I said, open it up for questions. So if we don't cover something in the 2 hours, that's okay. Next time we do one of these updates, we will cover that information as long as it remains relevant. Um, this is going to be recorded, so you can watch it later on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more information. If you like what we do, here's our meetup link. That way you can always see the presentations we're about to do. And we like, uh, doing what we do. We do it for free, but please, YouTube costs money, meetup costs money. Um, if you like what you see, please give us a few pennies for your time. All right. So the genesis of the current Iran-Israel relationship really comes out of the Islamic Revolution, right? During the period prior to the Islamic Revolution, Iran and Israel had a diplomatic relationship. Iran recognized Israel in 1950, had a strategic and economic relationship with Israel throughout the period of the Shah, that was the king of Iran. That relationship was never terribly close from the perspective of the Iranians. From the Israelis, it was. And we see during the latter period of the Shah, especially in interviews conducted in the late 60s and early 70s, that there was a growing division between Iran and Israel. But even then, because both were part of the US led uh, world order in the Middle East, we could say, they tended to be on the same side. However, the Islamic Revolution fundamentally changed this relationship. And for and when Khomeini became supreme leader, and we'll discuss a little bit about what that means. Uh, when he became supreme leader, he broke all relations with Israel and declared Israel to be the little Satan, along with the United States, which was the great Satan. Both of these, the United States became the great Satan for empowering the Shah and allowing him to continue ruling, especially after the events of the 1953 attempted coup on the government. So one of the things that I touched on in my Iran presentation, and there's much more depth there. You can go see it on YouTube. But one of the things is that what Khomeini did when he created what's called Vilayat Fiqh, the government of the jurist, is that he created a political system that had no precedent in Shiite Islam in any serious way. There are previous Shiite-led governments led by Mohammed Bakr Majlisi, right in the 1500s. But by and large, the construction of a modern quasi-democratic institutional infrastructure was something that was very revolutionary within the Shiite world. And you can see a number of individuals, for example, in the lower left-hand side, uh, of Shiite religious Muslims who were emphatically anti-Khomeini, specifically on the grounds that they believed that this governmental system that he had constructed was a violation of Shiite principles. So we should say, what is that governmental system? And as you can see from this chart, it's a very simple system with only a few arrows in any one direction. The system exists at three distinct levels. The first level is that which is elected by the people. The second step is that which is elected by the people, elected by the people. And the third step is that which is elected by the people, elected by the people, elected by the people. So you can see that there is a increasing diminution of democratic power within the construct of the Islamic Republic. And I apologize for the graininess of this graphic. It's the best one I could find, and it's from the age when the internet was still, in its infancy. So you can see that the people elect the parliament and the president, and they elect some of the members, about half the members, of the Assembly of Experts. The Assembly of Experts are also called the Guardians. This is the judicial branch of the Iranian government. So the Assembly of Experts is partially appointed by the people. Sorry, the Assembly of Experts is below the Council of Guardians. But the Assembly of Experts is partially appointed by the Council of Guardians.
Recording in progress.
All right.
Sorry.
No, no problem. So the Assembly of Experts is elected by the people, and the Assembly of Experts chooses the supreme leader. But notice the circularity here, right? The Assembly of Experts votes on who the supreme leader will be. The supreme leader will appoint the clerics who make up half of the Council of Guardians. The Council of Guardians appoints the other half of the Assembly of Experts, which means that the voting body that approves who the supreme leader will be is one that is directly chosen by the supreme leader himself. It's a very democratic system for anybody who loves authoritarianism. So you have this entrenchment of the rule of the supreme leader, and it creates this system where the judiciary is uniquely empowered, right? Because the Assembly of Experts, the supreme leader, the Council of Guardians are functionally the judicial branch of the Iranian government. The Iranian government, like most Western governments, has three branches, right? The legislative, judicial, and executive, right? Of course, there are countries in Europe where the legislative and executive are fused, like the United Kingdom, but generally speaking, these are the branches of government as identified, as opposed to something like China, where the People's Liberation Army is one of the branches of government, right? Military is not a branch of the government in the West. So you have this situation where the judiciary is empowered, but if you notice, the parliament and the president are directly elected by the people. So it creates this imbalance of power between the president and the parliament on one side, which have responsibilities to the people that elected them, and to the supreme leader. But it gets even more interesting than that, because in order to be elected for any of those three positions, right, the parliament, the president, or the half of the Assembly of Experts that people vote on, you need to be approved by the Council of Guardians to sit in the election. So the judiciary has an effective veto over the entirety of the election process. You can imagine that, especially Shiite Muslims who were distrustful of authoritarianism, and there's a long history in Shiite Islam of being distrustful of authoritarianism because of the way that they were repressed under Sunni majority governments, that this system looks incredibly authoritarian to them. And that's why there was so much resistance in the early times of the Islamic Republic, as well as the fact that this entire idea of putting power in the hands of the jurist as opposed to having the jurist be somebody who advises government but is not directly in government was another source of opposition. Now, you may be wondering why I have this uh, pink purple bubble around the words armed forces. The Israeli attack on the 13th of June killed many individuals that were high up in the Iranian government, but almost all of them are inside of that one section of the Iran ruling structure. And this should give us a sense of the size and complexity of the Iranian government, such that even though Israel's strike destroyed a number of the leaders of various different military organizations, like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the the head the of the army, the head of a number of other different military divisions. It's all within the armed forces, and it doesn't even touch any of these other structures of government. Aaron, while we're here, do you have any comments you want to add?
Yeah, because I think this hopefully starts to illuminate when we've had a lot of, you know, discussion in, online and other places where people you throw around phrases like regime change. And, Richard and I have done almost a dozen presentations on the European Union and its structure. And I would argue this structure is
More
almost as
complex.
complicated or more complex than the European Union. And so, the idea that um, you're going to take out the whole regime, which I think what hopefully becomes clear is you recognize that this is an authoritarian bureaucracy, right? Which is really this new evolution in autocracy, which doesn't really get a lot of conversation in even political science circles, because there's lots of just binaries and very sort of simplistic, I'd say oversimplistic definitions that are used. But hopefully you recognize that when you have just this many senior positions, for every senior position in any modern advanced government, there's at least 100 worker bees and sub-senior positions. So you pretty quickly get into the tens of thousands of people that are at the center of power in the ruling structure, and that's independent of the 31 provinces and all the downstream structures from these. So you pretty quickly get into the hundreds of thousands of people involved just in what you might call core administrative state activities at the central ruling level of the state, independent of every local form of governance, which pretty quickly gets you into probably over 1 million people. So all of the sort of happy talk, and I don't mean that's happiness, but I mean, kind of the loose,
Fantastical.
yeah, exactly, fantastical discussions that people have about regime change, I think are really pretty absurd, actually. And especially after you had the initial concentrated attack on the senior leaders in the armed services, which was clearly a choice by the Israelis, right? And so, they obviously made a decision not to try to attack the other organs of the government, which, to be blunt, probably wouldn't have made a lot of difference because, as you can see, there's so many organs of the government that it's almost like Terminator 2 or Terminator 3, where it's just gonna, fuse around and regel up. And I don't say that lightly. I say that just they've engineered almost a perfectly bureaucratic authoritarian state that is pretty difficult to dismember. I mean, I would actually argue it's almost impossible, really.
Yeah,
Especially now, after the events of the last week or so.
I think that's right. So now that we've established what Vilayat al is, we then have to understand the external policy of Iran. A lot of I pointed out that there were two major sources of Shiite opposition to this principle from a religious standpoint. The first was that, right, this was a form of authoritarianism as opposed to democracy. This was a form of Shiite jurist-led governments when they held that when Shiite jurists felt that they should have a role outside of government. But there's a third element as well, which some have say is grafted from communism, some have said it was grafted from fascism. It doesn't particularly matter which side of the political spectrum it was grafted from. But what matters is that it has this universalist approach. And so the foreign policy of Iran quickly shifted from one that during the Shah was relatively isolationist, except for its near-term aims. The power projection that we begin to see coming out of Tehran um, is fundamentally different than anything we've ever seen before. And so, for example, in 1982, you have the meeting between Khomeini and Hafiz al-Assad in Syria. Now, Hafiz al-Assad was an Alawite, which is, depending on who you ask, a heretical Shiite sect or a post-Islamic religion, right? Some think of it like the Mormons of Islam, for want of a better comparison. And Khomeini grants Hafiz al-Assad legitimacy as the ruler of a country whose constitution says that only Muslims can rule the country, right? Um, in order to expand the power of Iran into Syria. It's worth noting that Hafiz al-Assad, despite being an ethnic Alawite, was not religious in any way. You also see the attempt after the Iraqi invasion to continue to push power into Iraq, which has a Shiite majority. And the ways of doing that increasingly opened up after the US began to invade Iraq in 2003, resulting in Iran funding several militias like Asa'ab al-Haq and Jaish al-Mahdi and the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF. All of these with uh, all of these with the goal of converting Iraq into a country that would be somehow within Iran's sphere of influence. And finally, we have the creation of Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria as a paramilitary force that would help expand Iranian power in Lebanon and Syria. And the creation of this set of states that expands from Iran to the Mediterranean has been called the Shiite Crescent, right? And the end of the crescent would, of course, eventually become when Hamas became part of that Iranian sphere. Now, I have a comment here that says that there's no such thing as an ethnic Alawite. I think that that's sort of misunderstanding what I'm talking about. It, being a lapsed Alawite who's descended from other Alawites, you are effectively your own ethnicity. And within the context of Syria, that is something that is understood in the same way that you can be an ethnic Kurd or an ethnic Assyrian or an ethnic Arab. Arab being synonymous in that case with Arab Sunni Muslim. Okay. There's a point here also that Hezbollah was created during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which is completely true, but it was created with Iranian funding, with a pro-Iranian orientation. There were already Shiite militias that existed in Lebanon at the time, like Amal, which did not have initial Iranian backing or funding. So, just to sort of put a cap on this Iranian foreign policy, we see the creation of what I jokingly call full service jihadist organizations. So let's take apart all of those terms. So a jihadist organization is one that believes that there should be a revolution against secular states in the Muslim world to institute states run by religious theocrats. And the full service aspect means that they don't just have a military arm or a paramilitary arm, they also have bureaucratic arms. So we're talking about things like running the police, building schools, running hospitals, organizing logistical development of cities and towns, the things that we would expect a government to do and not a paramilitary organization to do. Just for clarity here, because this slide came from a different presentation, the Taliban in Afghanistan are not one of the organizations that has a good relationship with Iran. They happen to be a full-service jihadist organization, but not one that has good relations with Iran. Now, the mechanism, of course, comes to its full fruition in Palestine and in Lebanon, right, with Hamas and with Hezbollah specifically. In the case of Lebanon, the state structure doesn't apply effectively in a number of the areas of the country. And so Hezbollah manages to take over basic services in those parts of the country. And of course, in Gaza, when Hamas won the Palestinian Civil War in 2007 and had direct governance of the Gaza Strip, they took on all of these aspects of governance. There's a point that the Hamas won an election in 2006, which is correct, but Hamas did not have control of the Gaza Strip because Fatah was rejecting them, and that required a civil war to eject Fatah. Within the Iranian space, there is always this discussion of reforming the Islamic Republic, right? You see this from individuals on the left external to Iran, especially. And you see this in the case of the Green Movement in 2009 and the Masa Amini movement in 2000 and 2022. These movements were by Iranians that had particular grievances with the Islamic Republic structure. They did not necessarily want an end to the entirety of the governing apparatus, but changes that would make it more easy to live as modern people, right? This is one of the frictional divides within the country. You have a significant population that is westernized, you have a significant population that is more conservative and religious, and these two populations are at loggerheads. In fact, probably the best time to understand this is the current moment in the United States, where you have a significant population that supports Donald Trump and a significant population that does not support Donald Trump. And these two populations are magnified by the external viewers to the United States to imagine what is happening in the United States because people find it difficult to associate with one of those two perspectives, never mind the fact that both of these perspectives are large percentages of the population. We should also note the difference between these movements, which are internal Iranian movements designed to address Iranian grievances, and external Iranian expatriates and other movements that seek the end of the Islamic Republic, usually through a military takeover. And so there's of course divide, and especially those Iranians who live external to the country, probably not by choice, have strong feelings about external invaders that perhaps locals don't share. And in fact, if you look on Iranian social media now, what there is, because the government is cracking down on the internet, but what there is has generally showed that even those that oppose the regime, those who were part of the Green Movement or part of the Mahsa Amini solidarity protests, are also in opposition to the attacks of a foreign state, that is Israel, right? Um, they're not seeing it as a liberation movement in the way that Iranians, perhaps external to the regime, do, and perhaps Israelis do. So, yeah, I guess the pictures don't show here. Throughout the latter part of the last 20 years, Israel and Iran have engaged in what are called are have engaged in a proxy conflict. The proxy conflict has taken several distinct forms. The first form has been where Israel has attacked one of the various groups that Iran has supported outside of Iran, be that Hamas or Hezbollah. These attacks against Hezbollah, for example, you have the 2006 war against Hezbollah, you had the war in 2024 against Hezbollah, um, and of course the Hamas conflict currently, but also there were a number of shorter conflicts between Israel and Hamas in 2008, in 2011, in 2012, in 2014. You also have Israel confiscating goods that are destined for territories controlled by Iranian proxies. For example, you can see this is on the lower left-hand side. This is the seizure of the Victoria, which was a ship bound for the Gaza Strip. The Israelis confiscated uh, the items that were on that ship and brought them to Israel, claiming that these were items that would lead to uh, these were military items that Hamas was planning to use against Israelis. And finally, you also on the Israeli side, you also have direct attacks on Israel on Iranian um, nuclear infrastructure, whether that's attacking the human beings, right, targeted assassinations, or the famous Stuxnet virus in January of 2010 uh, that destroyed a number of Iranian centrifuges by introducing a small anomaly in the calculations to run the centrifuges. On the Iranian side, you have typically bombings in third-party countries. Iranians have had difficulty perpetuating an attack directly in Israel without the use of missiles or bombs or something from the sky. Um, so we have the case, for example, the Burgas bus bombing in July of 2012 that took place in Bulgaria, where a number of Israeli tourists were visiting the country. You have the Amia bombing, which is in Buenos Aires, the largest Jewish community in South America, um, where this center was attacked because it promoted Argentine-Israeli uh, friendship and solidarity. But we should understand that the I in Amia is Israelita, which is usually the term used by Jews in South America. So it's not necessarily that only Israelis went there. Iran has denied that they had any role to play in these attacks. The Argentine government has typically found otherwise. So you have these sort of tit for tats. And of course, in the beginning of the Gaza war of 2023 to the present, there was an exchange between Iran and Israel of missiles that was short and ended with a ceasefire. There's a question of why would Iran attack Israeli outposts in Argentina? And the answer is quite simply that Iran has facilitated numerous attacks against Israeli diplomatic positions around the world. They perceive AMIA as one of those diplomatic outreach operations. So we also have, as part of the larger proxy war, we also have evidence that from this larger proxy war that Israel has attacked positions within Syria because Syria, as I pointed out, was part of that Iranian Shiite crescent, and the Israelis wanted to neutralize the threat on their border. This resulted in coordination with the Russians during the Assad tenure, and the destruction of many surface to air missile systems within within Syria that had been placed there by Iran, as well as members of the IRGC who were stationed in Syria. This Israeli attacks in Syria amplified following the fall of Assad, and Israel has effectively neutralized all Syrian air defenses, not just those placed there by the Iranians. Which is why current missile exchanges between Israel and Iran are passing over Syrian and Iraqi airspace as opposed to Jordanian airspace. There's less that could possibly interfere with the flow of those missiles. I now want to sort of shift. We've talked a lot about the external politics and the relationship. We talked about the internal politics of Iran, we've talked about the relationships of Iran and Israel, and we've talked about the domestic situation within Israel. So we'll shift to that. While Israel was founded as a secular nationalist state for the Jewish people as an ethnic group, that has shifted over the last, let's say, 30 years as Israel's religious population has increased. And Israel's religious population divides into two subcategories. The first are the ultra-Orthodox, who generally um, wish for welfare and exemptions from the military. and a much newer class of religious Jew, which is the religious Zionist. And in Hebrew, they're called the Datei, right? And their religious philosophy is that the state of Israel is part of the Jewish redemption that will come in the future, the Messianic redemption. And as a result, the Palestinians have no legal claim to the territories in Gaza, Israel, or the West Bank. This is a particularly uh, growing constituency because this constituency tends to have a large number of children, and they are an important voting bloc for any conservative government that wants to be in power. So we can see here Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, um, who are two members of this Datei Leumi community and are part of Netanyahu's key cabinet. These individuals have made their presence in Netanyahu's cabinet conditional upon Netanyahu being more aggressive towards Gaza in the Gazan war and more aggressive towards Iran as a general uh, part of Israeli policy. So as you can imagine, Netanyahu was somebody who was already in 2009 pointing to a bomb, Iran having a nuclear bomb within a few months, and saber rattling about that situation. You can imagine how much further he's being pushed in this circumstance. Not that I believe that he opposes it. I think that this lines up with his philosophy, but they're just more extreme about it than he even is. And this creates a divide within the Israeli population. We have a significant part of the Israeli population that is in favor of the conflict, but we also have significant percentages of the Israeli population that oppose Netanyahu on his own domestic politics. You can see the anti-corruption protests from early 2023 and the current protests on the lower left-hand side of returning the hostages and ending the war in Gaza and seeking a ceasefire against Iran because the hostages and returning them is more important. So there's this functional divide within Israeli society that isn't necessarily reflected in the Israeli leadership. And even with respect to the war, Netanyahu is not particularly well viewed. This is a clip from June 19th, so just Friday. Sorry, just Thursday, when Netanyahu was standing outside of a a hospital destroyed by an Iranian missile and pointing out that he is suffering because he has to delay his son's marriage, his son's wedding for the second time, right? Which was incredibly tone deaf from Israeli perception, never mind foreign perception. The foreign perception, of course, is that if Israel bombs hospitals in Gaza, why is it different if Iran bombs an Israeli hospital? So, and there's a point that there's no ethnicity called Jewish. Ethnicity is a sociocultural construct. Jews define themselves as an ethnicity. Jews who are externally defined as an ethnicity. Jews are an ethnicity. Okay, strikes. So, starting on June 13th, Israel launched an attack on several positions. First, in Tehran, targeting key leaders, as we pointed out, in the Iranian military, leaders with combined something close to 170, 180 years of experience. Um, you have also attacks on nuclear sites that are reputed by Israel to be weapon sites, like the Natanz area. What's important to note in terms of the Israeli strikes is that a lot of the suspected, at least by the Israeli and pro-Israeli advocates, areas that would have nuclear weapons are those that are deep underground, making it impossible for any bomb, except those carried by American bomber planes, from reaching. So Israelis tend to bomb using fighter planes, and so they can't carry the same kind of payload. So while these sites were hit, they weren't hit exactly in the way that Israel would like. And we'll talk about the implications of that when it comes to their relationship with the United States. Iran retaliated with several missile strikes at Israel. Now you can see this is a map of both Iranian strikes on Israel and Israeli strikes on Iran from June 13th. The number of strikes has amplified since then. Um, Large numbers of missiles have gone in both directions. Large numbers of drones have gone in both directions. By and large, Israel has effectively, with American assistance, intercepted most of the Iranian attacks, but a number of them did get through, unlike the previous strike in 2023. Um, on the Iranian side, the air defenses of Iran are much less able to intercept Israeli technology. Uh, and Iranians have claimed that they have downed one Israeli drone. Israel has rejected that claim. So, but regardless, one drone out of a few hundred uh, doesn't have Iran showing a strong defensive capability. Regardless, as most of the 20th century demonstrated, wars are not won from the air. And in particularly the case from Iran, Iran has already suffered this kind of attack before. This is what happened during the Iran-Iraq War in what's called the War of the Cities, where you had numerous missiles launched from Iraqi positions against Iranian positions and vice versa. And of course that war was not won by the Iraqis. It wasn't won by the Iranians either. Both sides decided to call a truce and walk away. So this shows in more detail the military individuals who were removed. So you have the Armed Forces General Staff, you have uh, the Khatam of Arabia Central Headquarters, you have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, you have the Airspace Force, the Al-Quds Force. But as I mentioned before, almost all of these individuals are part of that very small part of the government, right? They're not parliamentarians, they're not the president, they're not any of the experts or guardians or supreme leader. The Iranian government is largely intact,
Can you
despite the fact.
go back, Richard, real quick to that slide, just so everyone kind of can, also see that a second time? 'Cause I think it's important to realize the scale of the ruling state apparatus, right? This is just the top of the apparatus, right? So obviously underneath it is, hundreds of other structures, thousands probably realistically.
Yeah. Aaron, do you want to talk about the Isfahan Nuclear
Yeah.
Technology Center
So
and the Natanz Enrichment Center?
yeah. So I think one of the one of the challenges with the Israeli strike structurally is that the Israelis don't have long-range bombers, and so they have F-15, F-16, and F-35I, which is I for Israel. It's basically think of it as a sort of an off-the-shelf version of each of those aircraft, and then they modify them and integrate them into their um,
Just for
aircraft.
clarity, for those who might not know the,
Yep,
the numbers, those refer to fighter planes, so they
that's
have a
right.
limited payload capacity.
That's right. They have what are called hard points. These are these little like think of them as holding connectors underneath, and they can put fuel there. They can put surveillance modules. They can put traditional bombs and then they can put missiles or rockets. But they have a finite number of those hard points, each of those either F-15, F-16, or F-35s, and they also have a weight limit. And so while that matters, is that obviously these facilities have been engineered and hardened to prevent the majority of the facilities from being damaged by a traditional air power, fighter-based air power. And in some cases, these facilities have, in essence, sort of ant colony design underneath that goes down, probably at least 100 meters, but, in some cases, maybe hundreds of meters. Um, so so just right off the bat, structurally, there's a lots of limitations to the degree of incapacitating these facilities that is actually realistic. versus degrading, right? And so this sort of opens us up to that initial conversation, which Richard and I talked about. That's really important, which is you have a country might have war aims, but then there's realities of what their capabilities are to create effects for those war aims. And so since the Israelis don't have the ability to penetrate all the way down all these facilities directly through air power, the only other methods that you could use is actually forces on the ground and some other state, which there's only three states in the world that have strategic bombers at this point, which is China has a handful, Russia, which we'll get into the second part of this discussion, has less at this point, and in the United States, which is why there's this broader conversation about what President Trump and what the U.S. administration is going to do concerning Iran's nuclear program and if they're going to participate in these strikes. So to me, that's what's really important is sort of setting the table of reality. And for those of you that want to drill down, you can go to this website, ISW, which tends to follow all the conflicts, and they use open source materials. They have open source satellite imagery. What's nice about those sites is that they will show a time lapse of what's happened over a period of time. And when you look at that after a week, on the surface level, it's about 10% of each of those sites has been at the surface level,
Demolished.
significantly degraded or destroyed, or at least destroyed. I'd say degraded, maybe it's 40, 50% at the surface level. But you'd have to say realistically, you're not going to increase that percentage the deeper you go. It's going to, generally speaking, be more reduced. So you're probably dealing with 3 to 5 levels of depths in these facilities. And odds are the degrading is really just at that first or at the maximum, that second level, unless they really had a large operation of Israeli ground forces involved, special operations, which how complex those operations are, everyone would hear about it because obviously those type of operations are pretty noisy and it's pretty easy to get people, hurt, killed in those operations. That they're complex. To me, that's what's really important is sort of setting the boundaries of the proportion of what this operation could be. And this operation was really wide, meaning they went after. If
Number of
we go
targets in
back,
different areas.
yeah, if you go back a slide to that first slide, I have a little quick summary there at the intro of the slide. Oh, yeah, right there. So if you look at the top, they hit 10 airfields, 1 Navy base, 20 missile bases, 15 nuclear. Uh, but they define as 15 different nuclear targets, and that's something that's important too. Is realizing how spread out a program, any nuclear program is. I mean, anyone who has a nuclear program in the whole world doesn't have it concentrated in one great big bad guy island where everyone wears gray and has a long nail and says, ha ha ha. That's just not the real world. And they have, dozens of other military targets, energy, government, and leadership. So this is a really broad-based attack across the nuclear, ballistic, and military leadership complex. But given the size of Iran, which is 93 million people, twice the size, the landmass of Germany, as a percentage of state power, this is probably somewhere in the order of a few percentage points in terms of impact, because of the shock and awe hitting leadership and nuclear and ballistic sites. It's probably significant, 20, 30, 40% of that power. But that's why you have a bureaucracy, right? There's now a new number 2 guy or a new number 4 guy or a new number 8 guy, and now you're playing the whack-a-mole game. So if you so I have from ISW I think some good maps to give you a sense of sort of the scale of of the strikes
Israeli
that the
strikes.
Israelis have. Oh, go back.
Yeah.
Oh, Yeah, you scrolled. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you're flying through a few of those. Um, where
Yeah, I was
you
gonna say, is there one in particular? Because I want to give you enough time to do Ukraine and
Sure,
also Nourul.
absolutely. So, I mean, I think if you actually scroll back a couple more, if you don't mind, real quick. Yep, right there. So, and obviously, a claim strike versus a confirmed strike are two different things. I do think right now we're seeing, because of the open source, that the delta between claim and confirmation is pretty tight here, because the open source is pretty significant, and you're getting the imagery. So if you look on the right here on the 13th in the afternoon, you can see where they had, substantial strikes across, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side, across Iran, very, very concentrated, right? So they were very focused on these five target clusters, and it basically had continuous airstrikes against them. And they had very robust intelligence. Clearly, they have support on the ground, not just Israeli spies and Mossad and so on, but a third parties that are part of this. And they obviously, I think two things that are pretty important to understand is they hit the air defense complex in Western Iran extremely hard. And in essence, they have air supremacy over the whole west of Iran at this point. And they hit with what are called wild weasels. Wild weasels are um, aircraft that target, through anti-radiation missiles, air defense systems. There's not a specific aircraft that does it. So it's not an F-15. That's a wild weasel. It's any aircraft that does that. So that's just something to know as a byproduct whenever you see that term ever. So they really invested in the deconstruction of the whole Western air defenses for Iran, and why that's important is that allows them to be able to move up across other regions of Iran with their fixed wing uh, 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 airstrike capability, while they can use drones in the western part of Iran because those drones won't be contested. So this gives them this sort of cycle effect, and until Iran can either reconstruct some of its air defenses, meaning move them around, or shifts in tactics where they, maybe call up the Russians and get some support for anti-drone, because they clearly were not prepared both for the fixed wing strikes, but also the drone strikes. They were really caught, actually, which is ultimately somewhat strange given that Israel has had, back to 1981 with Iraq and its weapons program, its nuclear program, and Syria. This is something Israel has done now three times. So it's pretty clear that this was always going to happen at some point. And I think that's something we should maybe have a conversation about, is why did this happen now? I view it as BB-75. This is his sort of legacy. There's obviously all the corruption trials and et cetera, that he's sort of trapped in politically, and this allows a sort of a political extension. So I think there's some probably a little bit of truth to that, or that's a byproduct. But structurally, he wants this to be a legacy, that a substantial degradation of the Iranian nuclear program and ballistic program was achieved. And we don't know what the BDA is, the bombing damage assessments, but it's clear that there's been a substantial degradation of big parts of these programs. The question is, how does Iran reconstitute if they do? And how and who do they ally with if they want to reconstitute? I think objectively, they've sort of gone through their Russia and China phase when it comes to reconstituting or when it comes to the nuclear development. I think at this point, if they really did push for reconstitution, they would have to shift to sort of North Korea, Pakistan phase of partnering. And that opens up a whole host of challenges, obviously. Number one is Russia and China working against them doing that, because Russia and China have real issues with North Korean and Pakistan proliferation, backyard issues, basically. So I
Yeah.
think that's sort of a fundamental question,
I,
independent of sort of what's happening in the short term and whether the U.S. participates. Um, I would argue that if the U.S. tries to participate, it'll be very, very selective and very, very surgical because a large scale campaign would involve, to be honest, months of planning and shifting of resources all the way to that region, right? The US has 130 strategic bombers and 11 squadrons and another dozen wings that support those. Those are all the air refuelers and fighter planes that escort them and AWACS and all the missile defense for all those airfields. I mean, so this is not something, you don't move hundreds of thousands of people from, 8th Air Force and US Air Force Global Strike Command, in a day or a week or even a month.
yeah.
So I,
So
I don't see that as very realistic at this point. I think all Israel hopes for is maybe a handful of targets that the U.S. is determined they actually could penetrate and that there's something there to get. Because also, if it's already destroyed, or if the Iranians have already been able to move it, because I think something we might not fully appreciate is that um, what's the degree of Iranian preparations for strikes? Did they build additional storage facilities attached to
so
these
yeah.
main facilities?
So one of the other points that was made in the comments, and I would agree with this, is that given Trump's stronger affinity towards Israel than perhaps a Democratic administration would have been, and other Republican administrations may even have been, I think Bibi Netanyahu is also using this opportunity uh, to uh, to attack Iran, where he feels like he would get less consternation and more U.S. support. And so I wanted to sort of also end our discussion on Iran with two things. I was going to go through this slide, and then our fellow contributor Nourul wants to make a few points that perhaps we may have overlooked. So Aaron and I jokingly call this the reverse Pottery Barn rule, right? Because Pottery Barn, the rule was if you break it, you bought it. So Israel's rule is you break it and then just walk away, right? The lesson that Israel learned from the United States' misadventures in Iraq and in Afghanistan is nation building doesn't work. But more to the point, the manpower required is something that we could never do, and the force projection required is something we could never do. So they're more of the mentality of, we'll break it and somebody else will buy it, which is not terribly great in terms of end game planning. And so we need to think seriously about what a possible end game is. Now, from the Israeli perspective, they sort of hope that either there's an insurgent Iranian movement to topple the government, or the United States takes over from them and does some sort of nation building operation. Neither of those seem very likely to my eye. Um, the Iranian insurgent movement seems more likely, honestly. But we're talking about the difference between, a 3% likelihood and a 2% likelihood. These are very unlikely situations because of the complexity of the Iranian government. And because while what we're seeing right now is that Iranians are not, by and large, supporting within the country, are not by and large supporting the weakening of their government. They're supporting other fellow Iranians. So what would likely happen if you do have a fragmentation of the government, which I think is unlikely but possible, the fragmentation would likely go along ethnic lines. Um, there is a long history of Iran breaking up and reforming along ethnic boundaries. And so I have this ethnic map of Iran in the center, where you can see the Persians in pink, right? The Azeri, Turkish in light blue. Um, you have Lur in darker blue. Lur and Persian tend to get along very well. You have the Arabs in green. You have Kurds in brown, and you have the Balochis in the darker brown in the lower in the southeast. So the possibility of Iran breaking up if the government falls is quite substantial. And this would be a disaster from a humanitarian and social perspective. Iran has a population of at least 85 million people. And these kinds of wars are debilitating. I would imagine at least 10 million people fleeing in different directions, if not more. So you would have something like a Syrian civil war. In that fragmentation, we also have a historical um, precedent of Russia launching invasions from the north and conquering territory. This is actually a picture of from the war of 1828 to 1826 to 1828. This is the Battle of Ganja in modern Republic of Azerbaijan. Um, but Russia invaded Iran on five different occasions over the last 500 years. So and so a fragmented Iran invites Russian presence. I don't see much room for Chinese presence simply because power projection would be very weak. Um, and Iran's power players in such a situation would be very similar to the mob sort of organizations that existed for a time under the Shah. You can see Shaban Jafari. Shaban was one of the individuals courted by the United States in the 1953 Operation Ajax coup, and he led a number of mobsters who began to act violently in the streets against those aligned with Mossadegh and the communists in Iran. Um, I could imagine this happening again.
And also don't forget that Turkey is who is um generating a new cultural, political, and economic mobilization in their region, a greater
Which could
Turkey.
affect the Azeri, yeah.
That's right, the Azari and the Kurds, because obviously the moment any type of event happens, the Kurds are going to want to trigger some type of uh, agency and independence. The Turks are, I mean, you don't have to work really hard to imagine what Turkey's response will be to that. And then you also will have an Armenian and Christian response and Russian response to supporting, Christian minorities, which then of course will trigger an Azari response. And then let's not forget, which we don't see on the map, but just go a little bit to the right, and you have Afghanistan, which is basically the worldwide leader in poppy production, and so you would have hundreds of existing business mafias that would likely um, uh, create with mid-tier officers that are remaining their version of Zeta cartels, and basically, put the equivalent of a great big Tesla plant on top of Afghanistan in poppy production and conveyor belt, hundreds of, of thousands of kilos of opioid based products worldwide. So and then you have a huge arms bazaar because Iran has tens of billions, maybe even more of
Yeah, it's sort of like a
traditional arms.
post-Soviet situation.
Yeah, so
Um,
so my view is that given the size of this, this is the closest proximity to Russia not breaking up, but the Soviet Union uh, uh, dissolving after the end of the Cold War. This would be probably the largest geostrategic event since the end of the Cold War.
yeah.
I don't think anything's even close, actually, to be honest.
All
Um,
right, Nourul?
Yes, thank you so much. Before I begin, I just want to mention my gratefulness and thank you for Zach and Richard for allowing me to participate in this discussion. and express my viewpoint as well. Richard, as always, your historical references are absolutely amazing and very detailed. And Aaron, with your technical details about the aircrafts and all the details of the bombs that are there and facilities that are there, it's amazing. But I feel like the audience should be more not so technical enough, and so that's why I'm here to give that perspective of whether a general perspective. I don't have to go into the detail, right? So that's the reason I'm here. So Netanyahu has been lying about Iran and its nuclear bomb since last 30 years, and he has been asking for a regime change in Iran for decades. He has used some pretext to get America into a war with Iraq and Saddam Hussein in 2002 in a similar way. His intention is very clearly to start a war between America and Iran. Just like the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a lie, Iran has a nuclear weapon is also a lie. Everyone has now agreed that Iraq was a mistake. But was there any accountability or any prosecution of all the innocent lives that were lost in Iraq? Thousands of American soldiers dying and trillions of dollars paid by the American people going down the drain. What was the benefit of the Iraq war? In fact, Iraq war became a hub for many more radical groups, which Saddam Hussein never allowed to grow, actually. I personally do not support Iran or the Ayatollah, nor I am in favor of Iran having a nuke. I do not deny its history and its involvement in Hezbollah, and Bashar al-Assad and Houthis. Nevertheless, Iran is a republic state and a sovereign country, and did not attack any country before this, right? And it has the right to defend itself. Israel strikes Iran at the same time when Iran was trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with Trump administration. This is a fact. So Netanyahu felt insecure and targeted the Iranian claimed to be nuclear facilities and killed their scientists and military officials who were involved in this deal, possibly for peace in the region, right? So like all people have been saying that Israel has the right to defend itself, using the October 7th as a reference. So I believe that Iran also has the right to defend itself because of June 13th. So we should stop being hypocritical and biased. So it was Israel who actually attacked Iran first, and Iran has the right to defend itself. And Israel attacked Iran based on what? Based on a speculation that Iran has a nuclear weapon. Maybe after this attack by Israel, Iran will definitely consider making one nuclear bomb, right?
Yeah, it's the Libya question.
Yeah. So I'm going to
right?
point out
because Libya, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. So I'm going to point out the elephant in the room, which no one seems to notice, by the way. Why are we not asking if Israel has any nuclear weapon? The truth is it does have a nuclear weapon, by the way, because Israel has nukes secretively. So it violates the UN Security Council resolution by having the secret nukes. IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is never allowed in Israel to investigate if it does have any nuclear weapon. IAEA, however, was allowed in Iran, and it confirmed that Iran has no nuclear bombs. Non-proliferation of nuclear weapons is not signed by Israel, whereas it is signed by Iran. In 2023, Israel was the only country that voted against the United Nations General Assembly resolution titled Establishment of a Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone in the region of Middle East. So imagine that. Israel is the only country that voted against it. The National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard testified in Congress in March of 2023 that Iran was not working on a nuclear warhead. Our president dismissed her report by saying, I don't care what Tulsi says. That is very irresponsible of President Trump. All this confirms that Israel has some nuclear weapon and Iran does not. Ted Cruz recently was, he's a right-wing pro-Israel extremist actually, was recently interviewed by Carlson Tucker. And he quoted the Bible and from his Sunday school episode. He says, "Those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed." And he claims that the current Israel run by the Bibi Netanyahu government is the same Israel that the Bible is talking about. A country run by a government which lies, deceives, kills indiscriminately, dehumanizes, starves and murders children, prevents aid, rapes, bribes politicians to promote their agenda via APAC, manipulates, threatens, occupies, violates international laws, and is committing genocide are somehow God's chosen people. Well, it doesn't seem to be like that, isn't it? Ted Cruz, wearing his suit, actually quotes Bible to justify and cover up Israel's war crimes. It is as if same as an Islamist using the Quran to justify jihad.
So, Nourul, you brought up actually, I think, a really important point, which is Israel's nuclear program. So, Israel developed its own nuclear program, very similar to every other state that was not party to the initial wave of
NPT
nuclear
discussions.
Yeah, exactly. Which was in the 1940s and 50s, pretty much into the 60s, right? Which was, US, obviously the Soviet Union, which was Russia, but also Ukraine, which we kind of weirdly forgotten actually, but UK and France. So Israel is part of that that follow-on wave with India, and then later Pakistan, and Iran strategically obviously wants to be in that second wave, which was really a secret club and was really only blown open when India and Pakistan moronically did chest beating tests on each other and then got themselves sanctioned for 5 years and wasted a bunch of money and energy when they could have, when they already had the programs working. But that sort of froze everything in place. And I think what's important to understand, or what's important for us to maybe think about, is that Iran wants to join that club as what you might call a 2B member now, a second tier, second wave, third wave member, actually. And Russia, China, are not interested in really admitting anyone to any club, actually. And the United States doesn't really want to do that either on a consistent basis. Israel understood this really early on, and what they did is they ramped up the volume, right? And then they kind of switched to from that de jure to de facto state. And I think that's pretty important. North Korea is going through exactly really the same process Israel went through. And I think India's already India and North Korea are in that same kind of volumetrics of pushing their warheads into the, at least 50 plus range, if not eventually 100. Pakistan is, gonna, I think, always struggle with that in terms of volume, and maybe they don't even need it really, sort of from a game theory standpoint. But what it does do is it sort of locks them into the club, and Iran obviously wants to be in that club and then go through the ramping. I think the real structural issue is the proliferation issue in the region, in that Russia, China, India, who are, these sort of funky partners with Israel when it comes to technology and things like nuclear and defense materials, have all sort of accepted Israel in a de facto way as a nuclear state. even though, it's not part of it, any of the nuclear treaties. They really don't want to have Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Iran, because
I was
that's
going to
what
say that I was going to say
Iran,
that's the big issue is that
yeah,
Israel's strategic non-declaration
that's right.
is to avoid an arms race in the Middle East because if Israel officially has nuclear weapons, it will be impossible from a public relations
That's right.
standpoint in
Right.
Turkey or Saudi Arabia or
Or
any of the
even,
other major
yeah,
powers or
yeah,
Egypt
yeah,
to say that they're not pursuing a nuclear weapon.
that's
But then
right.
why blame Iran for having a nuclear weapon then? So Iran is also
Because
looking at the
Iran
neighbor.
signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which created
That's
certain
right.
obligations. Now, Iran reaped the benefits of that treaty through the construction of the Bushehr nuclear facility with Russian assistance, which was one of the benefits of signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that countries that had nuclear experience could assist you in developing a nuclear program for peaceful use.
So what you
So,
could say objectively is Iran made two strategic mistakes post-revolution. Number one, not accelerating a nuclear program in the 80s so that they could get to some state of a nuclear program by the, let's say, mid 90s, and be able to do it without signing any treaties, and also be able to sort of join and be ready to test the moment that when India and Pakistan sort of, you know, screwed themselves, they could test too, and everyone would throw their hands in the air. And then now it's, the way our minds work, three problems at once we're not really built for. And so then Iran would have just been sort of de factoed into that club, which, by the way, I do believe even if that happened, the Israelis would have struck, because the Israelis have proven that that's what they'll do to any regional state. Now, the question would have been at that point, would the Saudis or the Turks have attempted to go down that path? I think the U.S. probably would have done a unofficial nuclear umbrella to Saudis to kind of buy them off for another 10, 20, 30 years. That probably happens. Turkey's interesting though, because Turkey always has a extremely independent foreign policy and defense policy. I actually view they as the nexus in the region when it comes to all these things, because nobody really wants to poke that bear, like at a certain level, because at the end of the day, the Turks have such a huge defense capacity that I believe I believe Turkey could have a nuclear weapon in less than 5 years if they wanted
I
to.
think that's right. Anyway, let's shift to Ukraine because
Can I just point out
yeah,
like three questions if you don't mind? So
yeah, sure.
um, Israel has been dodging that question about having a nuclear power. If an interviewer asks anybody else, they just dodge it. So now the
Correct,
question is,
because of the strategic policy that we just discussed.
Yeah.
right? I understand that, but it's
Which
unfair.
all the major powers want them to dodge, right? That's
Correct.
the whole point. No,
It's
that's
And
the point. The
it's
Russians, the
unfair.
Chinese, and the US don't want Israel
yeah,
to
no, I
ever
mean
admit
I've
to
seen
having a
Mehdi
program.
Hassan ask this question and he thinks it's an incredible gotcha, but it's really not. It's like it's one of the reasons that when business negotiators go into a room, they don't disclose all the assets that they have to the other party, right?
At the same
It
time,
like
but I'm
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but Netanyahu is claiming that Iran has nuclear bombs, right? Which is also
correct.
a lie, by the way, and he's using that lie to actually bomb them.
Well, we don't know. I mean, so when you say it's a lie, that's, I mean, you couldn't prove
I
that.
gave you three references for why it is a lie, because they have signed two treaties, and the IAEA report, that's also another one. So that's very
I mean,
important.
people, I mean, come on. You're telling me treaties signed. I mean, look, the Russians signed a treaty. We're getting ready to go into another talk now on the Budapest Memorandum, which guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine under all circumstances. So, I mean, the idea that parties, international relations, sign treaties and then don't comply with those treaties is pretty standard bear. And especially that's why you have all the nuclear regulators. And at the end of the day, Iran had a choice to have full compliance with all the nuclear regulators they multiple times over, 2 decades, either kicked them out, either broke the protocols that are required by those regulators, by the adherence to those treaties. And that's real, right? Like at the end of the day, if Iran wanted to prove that they don't have an active nuclear program, they could do that. All the global nuclear regulators, are would prove that, because the protocols they have of testing and verification are uniform, right? I mean, this isn't. I mean, funny to say, it's rocket science. It really isn't rocket science when it comes to proving you have a program or not. And the Iranians have chosen to not allow those regulators into the country multiple times. And right now, as a negotiating position, that's where they box themselves in, because I think the only way out of this for them is going to be full compliance, and allow those regulators to come in the country and validate what they have, which it's pretty clear they have something probably substantial that they shouldn't have, whether it's centrifuges, whether it's whether it's already different grades of commercial and non-commercial uranium production, and they don't want that information out there, which makes sense. But the point is now they've boxed themselves into that position where either the Russians are going to have to cut a deal with everybody to take all that material out of Iran, which if I had to predict a deal, that's probably the closest deal anyone's going to do. And then,
Right. So now the question is like, they have been claiming also that Iran is the mothership actually for all the terrorist activities. Then why did Israel actually wait for like 21 months after the October 7th to attack Iran actually? So why now? I mean, why were they not attacking since the beginning of October 7th, right?
Well,
And what
one of the yeah, sure. So the answer to that is relatively simple. Um, Israel had to put all the leaders in one place to kill them all in the first strike. And this is sort of goes back to the reverse pottery barn rule, right? Israel is really good at breaking things. They're not really good at long-term results. So if you launch an attack and you get maybe 15% of what you're trying to get, um, that's much better than launching an attack and getting 1% and hoping the other 14% don't go to ground immediately, right? That's why the Hezbollah pager attack happened when it happened. That's why this attack happens when it happens. It's that Israel is waiting for whatever the confluence of information and opportunity is to get that singular first attack, because the sustained attack Israel can't maintain.
that's
right,
right.
precision
100%.
attack while for Iran, but also the indiscriminate attack when it comes to Gaza, which is
Correct.
Totally.
No, but
that's
no,
that
but no, but I would point. Gus is actually perfect to demonstrate this, right? The initial Israeli response was bad to the Hamas invasion on October 7th, specifically because the Israelis were not prepared, right? And then because they're not prepared and they're ambling into this war, they act in a way that their army has never acted in its history, right? If we compare, for example, the way they went through Lebanon in 2006 with the way that they're moving through Gaza, it's very different. Not that they were successful in Lebanon, they weren't, but they actually had forward movement. They had planning in terms of how they were going to do that because they had been planning that war for years. They hadn't been planning a ground invasion of Gaza,
well
and
for
and
my
that and that was the problem.
So hold on, wait, hold on. So we're going to have another discussion. I know I agreed with Zach and so on. We want to go into the Ukraine Russia because we're already
Yeah,
90 minutes into this. So I want to make sure that um that we cover that. So you've brought up fantastic points. We've had a great conversation. I'm not trying to cut you off, but then we won't get to the Russian
yeah,
Ukrainian update also. So if you don't mind, Nuri. I really appreciate it. And it was a great conversation, actually, also.
agreed.
All right. So, Richard, you want to do the intro? Because you like
Hi, welcome to discussing
to.
Ukraine versus Russia. Um, General orientation for those of you who may not be aware, this is a country called Ukraine. It borders a much larger country called Russia. They were previously part of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine has a large Russian-speaking population in both its eastern,
Oh, hey, yeah, can you go back one slide
Yeah.
real quick? Sorry.
Its eastern part and its southern part, which
Oh
is
no, no, no,
the
you're
area
right.
that
You're
Russia
right. Okay. Yep. No, 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 no. Go back. You were showing the map. Sorry about
yeah,
that.
and its
Yep.
southern part. And those are the areas that Russia currently controls, right? But you can see from this map that Ukraine's being able to expand its approach far beyond the borders of Ukraine.
So great. So if you go back one slide real quick. So what we wanted to do, we there's a little bit of a blend of the time we have left of discussing, day 12 of the conflict, which some updates since the last time we presented. Oh, I get some feedback here.
Oh,
Um,
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And then also talk about Operation Spider's Web, which was this, fairly historic attack against Russian strategic bombers, which really wanted to kind of, give everyone a big update on that because I think that's such a very unique sui generis type uh, of attack against one of the strategic triad legs. There's Russia and the United States have a strategic triad, which is submarine based, launched nuclear weapons. The Russians actually have surface launch capability also, air launch through strategic bombers, either through cruise missiles and or direct um, legacy sort of nuclear weapons, and then obviously ICBM based launch systems. And the Russians also have mobile launchers that they can use once they left the last START treaty 20 years ago. And the U.S. could rebuild that capability. The U.S. has chosen not to pull together all the pieces of mobile launch nuclear weapons. So those are the two, actors in the world. The Chinese are somewhere in the construction of all that, but their naval capability is substantially limited when it comes to having strategic platforms that can deliver long range nuclear strikes. I think they have sort of like a baby triad. And then you could argue that same baby triad is sort of fused together between the French and the UK, because the UK has, four nuclear ballistic submarines, and the French have ICBM and a Mirage squadron that can deliver tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah, Aaron, we have a question in the comments, and
Sure.
it's sort of it was a question that I had. You mentioned that this is a sui generis attack, so a completely different style of attack than what we've seen before. And
That's
the
right.
comment we have that sort of interweaves with that is, from a military evolution point of view, the use of drones is bonkers. Not sure if we will ever see a massive change like that. Um,
Well, we always
and
see a massive change when there's a massive change. I don't mean to be reductionist there, but so yes, so the drone world has turned lots of things on its head. We're definitely in a unmanned drone era. And so we're going to go through a, revolution in military affairs. That's what these things are sort of labeled, RMAs, that go on every 25 to 75 years. It's been pretty constant in our modern history of the last, 200 or so years. This is another one of those, right? And I think we need to sort of put it on, in the same context that we went from a non-ballistic world, going into, let's say, the 1940s to a completely ballistic world, less than 20 years later. And I think drones in some ways or all the things we classify as unmanned systems are somewhere in that. Because if you think of that evolution of non-ballistics to ballistics, that also meant satellites, right? It revolutionized communications, it revolutionized flight, it revolutionized, a lot of modern life in ways that we don't even truly realize, right? Everyone, have whatever 5-7 billion people every day whether they should or not, use GPS on their phones for maps instead of actually knowing where they're going down the street. But that's a different conversation. But the point is that this type of revolution going on, I believe is in that same sort of dimension. And right now we're in the sort of, I call it the V1, V2, V3 era. So for those that can remember World War II, when the Germans launched V1s and V2s against the UK, against Great Britain, imagine if the Brits also had, countered with their own, I'm just making it up, V3s, and you would have this sort of back and forth. That's about where we are in this. So we're really in young days in this because we're using all of a different generation's technology that's been sort of glued together. So we're now going to get a purpose-built generation, right? So that's really important to understand is almost none of this equipment, very little, 1% maybe, was designed specifically to be military grade. So, we're in a world where we're using commercial technology to do this, but now we're going to go into the military grade phase, and I'd say the industrial grade phase as it goes into the rest of our lives. So we can point back to, many people might not like this, but the truth is, typically large scale wars produce some of the largest innovations that humans have ever had, right? We wouldn't get the surgery and medical technology if it wasn't for the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War and World War One and obviously World War
Yeah.
Two. So
No, of course, military pushes innovation. Can you talk a little bit about the attack? Like, for me, it's incredible that they're able to hit something in Irkutsk. That's
that's
at least, an 8-hour flight time from the Ukrainian border. How are they able
right.
to get this kind
Well,
of range without
so
hitting Russian air defenses?
yeah, so what's pretty clear, at least from an open source standpoint, and what we can sort of, guess or swag, is that they had Russian truck drivers that were not complicit, just driving trucks. They had Ukrainians posing as Russians. They had Ukrainian spies. They had, sort of all the above at a human intelligence and complicity standpoint, and also useful idiots. That tends to be when you have a big operation like this, you get a percentage of that. People just doing their normal job every day. Normal people, like when you go to the UPS store or whatever, you're not like looking around and seeing if there's a CIA agent doing something, right? That's just not, I mean, unless you're a conspiracist, but that's fine. That's a different story. But, under normal circumstances, that's not what you do. So people just blindly kind of go do what they do. And so they were able to position these trucks where inside these trucks, they re-engineered parts of these vehicles to basically, if you go back to the prior slide, you can see, and obviously everyone can go online and and you can see what these trucks were like. And inside these trucks, the tops would open up, and dozens of drones that were specially engineered for this attack. So to go after the sources of fuel, to go after the engines, to go after the fuselages, to go after the electrical systems. So they went really, really very specific, and they basically the estimate is, they launched somewhere on the order of 1,000 to 1,200 of these drones, of which blank hundred, three, four, maybe 500 had some effects, of which maybe 100 or 200 had devastating effects.
So am I to understand from the way that you're saying this, the drones were pre-programmed to search out certain areas using artificial intelligence, or were
Yeah,
they being manned remotely?
well, a little bit of both, right? So they had, obviously they did a lot of test runs. And by the way, the one thing about the Ukrainians, it's pretty clear, is they have their own agency, meaning they're not asking for permission from anybody to do these types of operations. They did this, completely independent, which means when Zelensky was meeting with Trump, and the Oval Office, and that whole fiasco happened, and and Trump said, you don't have any cards. Well, he obviously had this card and didn't share this card, right? So he did have some cards to play, and a pretty big card as an example. So yeah, so they integrated telemetry, satellite communications, separate communications networks, people on the ground that were also operators and backup operators, plus pre-programming. So they built a whole bunch of redundancy because they understood, when you do, and it's one of the reasons they've shared this, because when you have an attack this unique and sui generis, I mean, obviously the Russians have buttoned themselves up, at least from those strategic assets from being exposed. So you're not ever running this type of attack against strategic bombers and airfields in Russia again. And so, that's why they wound up sharing this. So I think that's, it gives you some of the background here. And when you look at, if you go a couple slides forward, there you go back one. Yeah. So, these are, photos of these air bases. And what's important to understand is these platforms, so these named platforms, right? So, the Tu-60, which is the Russian equivalent of a B-52, it's, one of the,
A long range bomber.
Long-range strategic bomber. It has the ability to launch, well more than half a dozen to a dozen nuclear cruise missiles, plus, hundreds of bombs. And then it's used also in the Ukrainian war because the Russians have taken traditional bombs and made them what are called glide bombs. So they can launch these extremely heavy 3,000 kilogram, 1,500 kilogram, 750 kilogram bombs. And so these bombers, can obviously do that. The other planes that are really important. So Tu-95 is a mid-large strategic bomber, and the 22 M3 is a smaller but extremely nimble strategic bomber. And I'd say the most important planes here are the AN-12s because these are the AWACS, the AN-50s, and a lot of the AN series. They use that as their strategic communications platforms where they'll fly these up. A whole bunch of other planes and drones and communications are going on to the ground. And so that's why this was such a unique strike, because it went really at the heart of Russian strategic air command. So if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the effects of knocking out Tu-95s on the ground. And one thing they did is one thing we can presume they did because of the effects is the programming of these drones. They were able to cross communicate with each other as a drone. So a whole bunch of them, once they sort of formed, what you would almost call like a wasp colony, or a swarm, they went in together. And that's why you can have some, huge effects like this from basically drones that are, half the size of your coffee table, basically each. The other thing too, this is sort of one of those, catch-22s. So really no military in the world, which is the US and the Russians and the Chinese also somewhat, has strategic bombers that work that they don't have fueled up for obvious reasons. Right? Because if it's a strategic bomber, it has a very large set of fuel tanks, right? And if you want to use them on a moment's notice, you don't want to wait hours to fuel it up and deal with all the tests that you have to do. So they're more often than not fueled. Well, guess what? That's a great big jet fuel tank ready to explode with a fairly thin set of what do you call it? Fuselage that acts as a barrier. So that's a byproduct of what they were able to effectively take advantage of here in their attacks. If you go to the next slide, So you could see, as they hit multiple, air bases, which, these air bases are, are like any traditional strategic air base in the interior of, Russia or the United States or, China for that matter now, um, is that they're, buttressed in, military neighborhoods and just general residential areas, because obviously there's not really a threat to them, or there wasn't a threat to them. By the way, this is going to transform the calculus forever when it comes to these strategic assets, because there's always been this debate, which is, well, do you want to, basically barricade these to effectively protect them? And obviously, legislators, whether they're from a communist state or an authoritarian state or a democratic state, say, hell no, that costs a lot of money. And by the way, when I say a lot of money, oftentimes it would cost more money than the bomber to build the concrete hardened facilities, right? So, we're not talking about a few dollars here. We're talking probably in the United States, tens of billions of dollars. And that's independent of all the air defenses you'd have to get and everything else, which is obviously what we're going to do. Same thing in China, same thing in Russia. So there's going to be a different world than we ever had when it came to these strategic assets, which is going to mean that in a strange way, it's more likely that they're going to become our new versions of just ICBMs, right? They're just going to be a strategic deterrent, because they're just going to cost so much money, and they're going to require so much. They generate so much risk, right? Because losing them represents a dent in your strategic capacity, which doesn't really matter in math terms, but it matters in
Force
strategic
protection.
prestige. Yeah, like Chinese, US, or Russian prestige, which, as the top strategic powers on the planet, that prestige is what, large strategic powers trade in. So that's going to be this new world that we're going to be in. If you follow on to the next slide, you can see this where, you have, and I mean, if someone said to anyone a year from now that this is what you would see, I mean, it's literally not believable, right? Like if you saw a bad Saban movie on Cinemax or free streaming on Tubi and it had this a year or two ago, I mean, it'd just be absurd, right? It's just not realistic, because this is such a critical strategic part of the triad that the Russians have, right? And the estimate is that about a third, because you have to realize the Russians have, or US or China, which has a smaller number, you have a total number of these platforms, but 25% or so are always going to be in some form of maintenance, cruise retraining, turning over, upgrades, et cetera. So of the actual available Russian fleet, the estimates are minimum 20 up to 40+% of the fleet was damaged. And so, and by the way, no one makes any of these platforms from anyone anymore. I mean, the Chinese are realizing how hard that is, because they're generating their strategic bombers one at a time, from a handful of basically bomber manufacturers that don't want to even do that. They'd rather figure out how to compete with Boeing and Airbus, because they could make 100 times more money. And the U.S. and Russia, obviously don't produce any of these anymore and don't want to, because no one would produce these, right? You'd have to be a government-owned contractor to do that. So the reason that's important is that going forward, the Russians are going to have to go to their boneyards, which is where you store all your old planes, and just cannibalize to produce, the next generation of working strategic bombers. So medium term, the Russian inventory is just going to drop, right? The new number the Russians will have will probably be 80 instead of 110 or 120. And then that means as those retire out, they'll
So
probably settle at 60 or whatever. That's a big shift and power. And the reason, the last point on this is that you don't fly all these at once. I mean, it's not some video game, right? Because, these are shifts, these are different commands and squadrons. So you can only put so many in the air at one time. And the Russians, traditionally might be able to put, let's say the low end 6 or 8, at the high end maybe 20. Now that's gonna get probably cut in half. And that means it's not as much of a strategic deterrent anymore. So this is
So
a big shift in the balance of strategic deterrence for the Russians.
absolutely. Now, we've talked a lot about how this attack was crippling and what it shows about Ukraine's capabilities. Can we sort of zoom out a little bit and talk more about the general state of the Ukraine-Russia war
Yep.
and what's
Yep.
been happening?
So there's someone here, Ivan. I hope Ivan's still here. So I also wanted to bring Ivan in. Yep, Ivan's still here. So Ivan Torres, you can is Ivan still here or no, he's not?
Yes, he's
Okay.
here. Let me
If you could
let
bring him
me
in also. So Ivan, I don't want to steal your thunder to introduce yourself as your background, but if you also want to introduce yourself, he's a very popular person on social media when it comes to this conflict also. So, are you there,
Oh
Ivan?
no,
Go ahead.
yeah. Sorry, I know you've been going for a while. Just joined in
Yep.
here at the tail
I
end.
I I also made you co-host so you can turn on your camera if you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine too.
Yep.
Oh no, yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have a camera.
So
Okay.
you want me? Is it okay if I introduce you, or
Oh
you?
yeah, sure, yeah, sure.
So,
Yeah, go
so
ahead.
for those of you, there's a very, I would say, the most extensive, consistent mill blogger, Jomini of the West on Twitter, who is, I don't know at this point how many thousands of images and graphs that you've produced and shared. I don't know, probably at least a few thousand, um, and
Yeah.
a very extensive military strategic background in the U.S. Army. And so they just wanted to introduce you, and then we could have some slides here, and we can kind of talk. You have strong points of view, and follow the conflict from the beginning. So, um,
Without any further ado.
yep. So jump
Uh,
in anytime you want, Ivan, and uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
no,
So
yeah, sure.
I
I'm
would
sorry.
say
Go ahead.
catch us up on the last few months of what's
sure.
been going on in Ukraine. We talked a lot about this massive spider attack, but let's talk about some of the other things that have been going on.
Um, well, that's a that's a long answer. I don't know how much time you have left. I think there was a schedule in about 10 minutes.
Yeah,
So
we always go over a little. Don't worry about that. So anyone who
Yeah,
wants to
especially if we
stay,
have a guest.
yeah, exactly.
oh, okay.
And today we have two, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So well, the past few months, well, I guess it go back to about maybe the beginning May timeframe. Um, so that brought the Russians out of about a 3 month slower pace than they had kept throughout the second half of 2024. Most of this was due just to reconstituting from losses sustained uh, during the second half of 2024 to reconstitute their forces in preparation for both the spring and summer, as well as the big focus at the beginning of 2025, which of course was uh, to collapse the salient in and around Suja in the Kursk Oblast, right, to push the Ukrainians out and back into northern Ukraine, which was completed about really about mid March, but not until the end of March, early April. Although there is a very small sliver of this is not ground necessarily that the Ukrainians control, but it is still a contested ground within Kursk itself that the Ukrainians still are able to, at least as far as what the old Suja salient was. Um, to where the Ukrainians still have or some activity in, and of course, I'm sure everyone's aware of the other two much smaller incursions just south of Suja, which was into northern Belgorod Oblast, and then just most recently in the further west of Kursk Oblast, around Teniko, where the Ukrainians they're still doing operations near in the Teniko area. They're not in Belgorod. The Russians have pretty much pushed them out of that small area that they did occupy in the Belgorod region. Although again, there is a small sliver of territory there that's still within the contested slash gray zone. You might hear that term too, which just
And
means that the area is contested. I'm sorry.
I, yeah, Ivan, can you clarify a little bit about why Ukraine is continuing to push here? Is there a strategic advantage? Is it to just deflect Russian strength? Is it psychological victory? What are they going for here?
So, just just real briefly, a big, 30, 50,000 foot overview of the current state is so the Ukrainians are currently find themselves in a very difficult strategic situation. Um, their current main focus is to hold the Russians as as close as they can to the current line of contact in the Donbass and in eastern Ukraine as they build up and what they have been building up just to the west side of Slovansk, Kramatorsk, Kupiansk, and just northwest of Pokrovsk, a new, more extensive defensive line. And this probably symbolizes or is going to represent for the Ukrainians their final strategic defensive lines, right? So the line that they're in essence uh, not willing to move further west from, if that makes sense. And so just uh, if you're not too familiar with the geography of eastern Ukraine, so really that line pretty much runs along the western border of Donetsk province. And that's the central province. If you see there at the bottom, let's see on the right side of this slide, that bottom, sorry, excuse me, chart, that the white space where the Ukrainian flag is, that's essentially the part of Donetsk province, or sorry, oblast, that the Russians do not occupy. And of course, Luhansk and Donetsk were the two oblasts that were, central to the initial separatist movement back in 2014, 2015. And this also too represents the last part of uh, the most strategic economic center of eastern Ukraine, which is the Donbass Industrial Zone. This is the Donbass Industrial Zone is a large area, about 30 square kilometers or so, that goes from that western border there for Donetsk and Luhansk, stretching actually back into Russia. Uh, this region is to Russia what the Ruhr was to Germany, right? It's the area of so going all the way back to the 1890s to the Russian Empire, and then through the Soviet era was essentially the heart of industry, for Russia. So as far as an economic prize, that'll be essential to the reconstruction effort afterwards for either Russia and or Ukraine, right? So if Ukraine loses this region, that's a hit of about let me see. I'm trying to recall off the top of my head of what it would cost to their GDP. It's a huge chunk
Yeah.
because they would
No,
essentially lose
but
their industrial
what I'm trying to
base.
understand is because you mentioned with respect to Kursk that there are
Mhm.
new invasions in Belgorod, that they're trying to retain the area near Timiko, like all of these sort of fingerings into the Ure territory. I'm trying to figure out what the motivation is to continue, right? Because the Western perception was that the initial invasion into Kursk was to distract Russian attention and show the weakness of the Russian government in actually protecting Russian citizens. Now that this has been demonstrated, right, what's the point of continuing?
I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
I will say real quick that um, what it does do is it creates more dilemmas, right? So one of the things you always want to do in a, let's say large scale conflict like this is you want to be generating more dilemmas uh, for your counterparty as much as possible, because now you are trapping their decision makers into constant loops. They're called OTA loops of figuring out what the best decision is going to be or not. And inside that, if they're forced to make enough of those decisions, they're going to make mistakes, right? It's just inevitable. Or you're going to give them dilemmas where there's, just two bad answers. And eventually, if you do enough of these, you will achieve either advantages in targeting or advantages in a breakthrough, or you will frustrate your opposing forces, because one of the dilemmas might be, or it will inevitably be, a resource constraint that you will now make separate commands fight over, which that means they're looking inward. So if you can, it's called trapping your enemy in their OTA loop. If you can trap them in their own decision loop, you can really kind of
Move
generate
around them.
effects. Exactly, and frustrate them. Ivan, I kind of butchered that a little bit, but I don't know if you have a cleaner way of putting that or not, or if
No,
that's
yeah, right. I was about to get to the point, right?
yep.
So uh for the Ukrainians trying to sorry, I lost train of thought there for a second. Um to As part of a larger effort to manage the fight in the Donbass, there has been the thought process has been amongst the senior command at the national level, at the general staff, and of course within the government, to conduct more aggressive border incursions, like the scale of Kursk, and what they're continuing to try to do within the region, kind of for like some of the reasons that Aaron kind of just laid out for us there. But unfortunately, that has not produced the effects that the Ukrainians have been trying to produce for the past, now almost, well, it'll be close, it'll be a year right in August, so
Yeah,
close
no,
to a year.
I actually wanted
Um,
to ask a little bit about that. So Aaron and I have discussed this on other episodes, but I wanted to hear your perspective on this, right?
mhm.
We're in an age where we have, the ability to do these drone strikes deep into Russia, right? You had trucks driving them across the country. You have spies and complex nets behind the Russian border. Why is it so hard for the Ukrainians to move past this fortified defense along right, this hard red line, right? Why doesn't Ukraine have some ingenious technology or advantage that allows them to move past this line?
One is not about technology. Two, they don't have an advantage. Right now, the Ukrainians suffer from two things that are very debilitating to their war effort. The first one is a complete, utter lack of unity of command that starts from the national level down to the front. The way that they have, or you can also say have not uh, organized their armed forces for this type of a fight, um, makes their units ineffective above the battalion level in the field. There is no unity of command, and if you don't have unity of command, you're not going to have unity of effort amongst your different operational areas. And if you don't have that, then you cannot um, conduct the types of operations at scale that you need to to move, the line in the direction that you need to move it to.
And one of the reasons they replaced, a lot of people might not have picked up on this in the last 24 hours, they replaced their land forces commander sort of in a George Marshall-like move where they took a brigadier general, so a much younger general, and shot him up the list, 30 to, just like General Marshall was, like, I think 104th on the command list when he was made chief of staff. And what's important about this person is that he's someone who has attended the U.S. General and Staff College as an honor graduate. He went to NATO Command School. So they're clearly in this shift, which is obviously going to take time, probably a year or two, of revolutionizing their command integration going forward, because their prior generations of commanders, to all the things they did effectively, which was organizing local forces, and the Ukrainians from battalion all the way down to squad are incredibly effective, and fight, I would say, way above their weight in relative terms and resource wise. But as Ivan was saying, and obviously, if you build on that or not, but everything above battalion is somewhere between a mess and a train wreck. And there's no sort of magic manual for this. Like, you have to have gone to these Western NATO type schools, or the old Russian effective, Cold War type schools. If you don't have either one of those educations, it's pretty hard to organize regiments and brigades and divisions and corps. It's not a video game or a game of Risk or whatever. It's these are some of the most complex organizational efforts in our history of our species, basically, because you have so many thousands of variables to have to deal with, internally and externally.
Right. Yeah. So there's just such disorganization at the critical levels right now within the Ukrainian military, that about the only thing that they can do kind of sort of well is hold the line. And they're holding the line increasingly with drones because of the other big problem, which of course is the manpower issue. Their inability to have reformed their mobilization recruitment process to keep pace with losses, and then to build out new formations, train those formations effectively, so that way then you can create a larger, or in the case of Ukraine, an actual strategic reserve, that then you could use that force and to then conduct again the type of operations you need to fundamentally change the situation
Yeah,
on the ground.
And Ivan, we'd talked before here on with Richard and
Other
myself
videos.
Mhm.
on other videos about the Ukrainians politically not willing to mobilize both 18 to 29-year-old men, and what I would say volunteer women at scale. They are, so it's a very unique kind of existential war, because it is an existential war. But if you look at other states, whether it be Israel, whether it would be a country like Vietnam, whether it would be, I mean, I would say Iran at a certain point. I mean, regardless of how they believe women should be treated or not, if there's a true point of existentialism, I could imagine them also mobilizing at least a volunteer.
There are women who
Right, 'cause
fight in the Iranian
Oh, there are.
military.
But it's only 70,000, right?
Yeah.
yeah, right.
And
Yeah,
effectively, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was gonna say, yeah, the 1824 project, which is the incentive, right, for 18 to 24-year-olds in Ukraine to volunteer. So far, under the incentives that are being offered in a recruitment a campaign, that also too has yet to produce the levels, right, that they
And I mean,
need.
I also think they have a gap in what I would call forward strategic purpose. So I think it's pretty clear when you look at this map, right? So the Russians made one, you know, gigantic galactic error in launching an invasion across, 1,200 kilometers or more, really 1,500 plus, with a force that was at least 10 times smaller than you would need to do that. And but what that's done also is forced a dilemma on the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians really did not respond to in the first 18 months of the conflict at all, which was to build a fortified defensive lines and build huge fortifications. They've, in the last year, really started to emphasize that and are building that. But when you're talking about a distance of, literally, 600, 800, 900 miles in length, and you'd want depth of miles of depth of fortifications and layer dozens, hundreds of layers, that I think one of the vision and imagination gaps they have is leveraging that new mobilization layer to focus on fortifications and then generate we could say compensation for the success of that. Because I think one discussion that isn't really had often is that the war is still at a heavy kinetic level because the Russians uh, don't believe that that the Ukrainians have enough fortifications, whether that's true or not, but they don't believe it, to stop them from advancing. Whereas the Russians believe they have enough fortifications to, in
Prevent
general,
the reverse.
prevent the reverse. And until the Ukrainians basically build that fortification line and locking in basically the world's largest DMZ, which this would be 3 times larger than the South and North Korean DMZ, then you're not going to get to the strategic stalemate, right? And Ivan, I don't know if you want to comment on that or if you disagree or you have other.
No, yeah. So this was this is, I mean, there's many different reasons why, going back to the original question of why is the line not moving east, right, as opposed to its steady move west. So yeah, just to piggyback off of the things you pointed out, Aaron. So this would be the third thing, right? As far as um how the Ukrainians started to um it's probably not well, for lack of a better term, uh more effectively react to the realities of the war itself, right? So when they did start to build fortifications um, within central western Donetsk, some in Luhansk, of course, down in Zaporizhia and so forth, the first attempts at that were not all that great. We saw that right throughout last year in how kind of ineffective they were. But the renewed effort that they've taken since the end, or they started toward the end of last year, and then of course throughout the winter and springtime, as we're heading now as we are in the summer, is proven to be a little bit more better. And of course, the one they're the as I mentioned earlier, kind of like that new final line is more so looking on the level as the Sharifkan line, what the Russians built. So it's way more extensive. It's much better planned, and so forth. I don't think it's so much of one part where I disagree with your assessment, Aaron, is not so much. I don't think that the Russians think that they don't exist, is that they're trying to hurry up to get to it before it truly exists, right? But
But I would say
here
this.
come.
So,
Yeah, go
so,
ahead.
so this is interesting, and I don't disagree with you. So the Russians, even though they have, and to their credit, they have transformed their command structure. They have probably the command structure that they should have had when they invaded, but of course they had to go through all those,
Right.
fairly competent commanders and leaders and strategies to get to here. Um, they're still pursuing this strange duality, which they're looking for this, magic pocket salient collapse, right? And this triangulation. At the same time, they're pursuing this front wide, line of, 800-mile wide line of contact probes and strikes, right? They're unable, and I think this is something about the strategic mindset. They're unable to, um, they're unwilling, I should say, to shift resources to the priority of the triangle of the salient, which would basically lock in control on Donetsk, which is what they'd like to do, is take over all of the nets, and potentially have weaker support along the line of contact. They're just unwilling to make that trade. So they're stuck in this protect the line strategy and make a dent of about the size of a housing block every week, which will take them about 600 years to get to the end of the nets. So I think there's something fundamental that they're unable to reconcile strategically, and at this point, it doesn't look like they will.
But
I don't know what you think about that or not, but
so I guess just to close out the Ukrainian side here real quick, I guess for this segment. So along with that final or that the new defensive lines that they are making, there is also the other part of it, which is meant, of course, to hold the Russians as long as possible, so that line can be finished. Of course, is the drone wall, right? So just in what they have been doing for quite some time now, but it's been escalating in scope and scale. And this year, it's going to be the most intense since we've seen the switch to compensating for the lack of infantry on the ground by the use of drones for the Ukrainians. Is in essence, this wall of drones, right? To keep the Russians, or to slow the Russian progress as much as possible. Although, along with that, the Russians have caught up with the Ukrainians as far as the volume and scale and how they're employing drones. They're really at parity now. There are, of course, areas where the Ukrainians can get localized superiority for a time. Russians can too, right? When it comes to the use of drones and FPVs along the line. But kind of getting to your point, Aaron, I think it's so kind of the way that I see it, it's not so much that there's the unwillingness to prioritize. I think there is. And the Russians are showing that they can prioritize pretty well. I think that you rightly pointed out the Russians more quickly than Ukrainians, and plus they just had that institutional knowledge and background of quickly falling back on an older style of command structure that they're able to build out, and is what's made them more effective so far at their ability to better manage, right, the battlefield. But I think it does go to and shows the effectiveness or the impact maybe of the just the sheer volume and how the Ukrainians employ both their drones along with their artillery, right? In symbiosis with one another to effectively target the at least the near logistics, right, on the battlefield for the Russians to slow down. So that's part of the other mix, right? To make sure that you're striking as deep as possible to targeting depots, command nodes, and whatnot, again to disrupt the Russian sequence and cycle of offensive operations, which of course is very set, right? They have a very set paint by the numbers. We do 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can't do 4 without doing 3 type deal. So if you could disrupt that, that also too kind of slows them down. But there are some and just like Ukrainians, and I don't want to make it sound like Ukrainians are all that they don't know what they're doing. They obviously do. They just have a lot of confusion above their battalion and brigade level
Yeah,
on
no,
how to effectively do stuff, right? Or
yeah,
how to effectively manage the battlefield.
yeah.
And
I think
there's
that's
some Russian units that are good, that are very good at it, particularly the 8th Guards Combined Arms Army. And they've been moved around, the battlefield quite a bit this past year, and where they've moved is where the Russians have had their most success, because they've really got of how the Russians approach things. They're probably the best field force right now the Russians have. Um, and then there's some Russian units that don't do it, well at all. So there are definitely, challenges on both sides. Some good techniques on both sides, and then others where it's and then other places along the front where it's not so good, and that's where you get the more static.
So
yeah,
good question, Richard. How long did you want to go in number
yeah, no, no.
two?
I
Do
was
you
I
want
was
to
going
come
to move
back?
to the question and answer period.
Yeah,
I just wanted to sort of clarify for some of the viewers who may not be as familiar with military organization that the functional distinction here is between, at the lower level, they're able to execute on the plans that they're given. That the higher level, it's difficult to coordinate the plans between the different groups, right? So you can execute well, but but the strategic element, the organizational element is missing. So now I wanted to open it up to Q&A, and I actually have a question on Ukraine. I figure since Ivan is still here, we should start with that. And the question is, given the fact that the United States is really not going to be funding the Ukraine wars, at least that's what it looks like from the Trump administration, um, is Ukraine actually able to make up for the shortfall? Are they able to either spur on domestic production, get support from Europe? What does this look like in this new phase of the war?
So really, moving forward, what's going to be less from the United States is mostly direct military aid. Although, and so that comes in forms of like packages, right? Ammo, vehicles, so on and so forth, right? Just basically your equipment. So that's the biggest thing that we'll see a downturn on. However, I think it was a week or two ago, there were two small packages of new assistance that was given. Kind of went under the radar with everything else going on in the news. I think that's it. That's just why it was under the radar. So it's probably not like it's going to 100% end, but it'll definitely be a lot less than what it was before. So Ukraine currently, of all their weapon systems, so in essence their defense industrial base that supports their war effort, 40% comes from internally from Ukraine, and then that's grown a lot. So a huge chunk of their own ability to be self-sustaining is now domestic to them. Europe is ramping up. It's going to take them a little bit more time though to fill that a gap left by the U.S., but they can, at least in theory, do that, and they're gearing up to be able to fill those shortfalls. So, will there be a really big material drop? Um, Maybe for a short period of time. I think we're currently in that short period of time, but definitely by the fall, there probably won't be such a noticeable difference than what there currently is. And the U.S. is actually still finishing delivering the last few aid packages anyway, right? So that's another reason why it's really not going to be, there's not going to be a big huge gap where that material support is going to have a negative impact on the front. But we are continuing to give, which is probably the most important piece, which of course is the intel support, both us and NATO. Now, we might maybe cut back on some flights as far as like satellite coverage, reconnaissance flight and so forth. But that's just because assets are currently right now being focused elsewhere. But if and when crises in other parts of the world conclude, there's a possibility that those assets will be swung back. But Europe is stepping up a little bit more than to fill that coverage gap.
Yeah. All right. So if you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, you can put it in the chat. If you prefer to speak, please raise your hand and I'll call on you so you can speak. Um, I would favor Ukraine questions first because we have Ivan here. Um, but if we don't have any Ukraine questions, we can go back to Israel and Iran.
One other quick
Uh,
question, and I know because we didn't cover everything that was obviously in the presentation on the Ukraine-Russian war. Ivan, in the future, do you mind if we do a dedicated session that we could kind of drill back into a little deeper here? Is that something you're, the next week or week after, whatever? Is that something you're
Oh
available
no, yeah, sure, absolutely.
for?
And then I'll sorry if I was throwing any terms around that may have been very military that maybe
I was gonna
went
say
over some people's heads,
you and
but
Aaron have a language that it's taken me years to decipher, and I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, so I can
You're
imagine
pretty sharp, Richard. So
I imagine a few people might struggle as well. Mark, you have a question? Let me unmute you.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Ivan. If you could speak a bit about the popular narrative of the Russian performance in the beginning of the war, and basically how well they did do. And I understand that they had seven thrusts, seven different penetrations that were independently commanded, but that they perhaps came closer to victory than people think.
yeah, right, yeah, and this is something definitely that we could explore in the future more in depth, Aaron, if you would like. So, but yeah, so just real quick, because there's a lot of info right out there about Ukraine, or about any of the major conflicts going around the globe right now, and I think that we all of us here have probably had our fair share of frustration trying to sift through, of course, what seems to be plainly obvious as people just trying to push a certain narrative, the propaganda, whatever the case might be, one way or like the other, right? It's like, hey, what's the closest to ground truth that's out there? And when it comes to the war in Ukraine, I think that there's the still, even after all these years, there is a disconnect in, for lack of a better term, again here, maybe what we would call mainstream media, and I'm using that as both, hey, print, news, social media, all the different ways that we get our news, that in which I think is what's kind of causing some of the confusion of, well, why is then the war the way it is? Of there's this general sense of, I think, Russian incompetence, and that the Ukrainians are just so innovative and so forth, and are always surprising the Russians. But then yet, of course, we have the situation that we do have. The reality of it is that the Russians are not and have not been as clumsy or incompetent or doing stuff that's outdated, outmoded, as much as maybe as being portrayed in the popular narratives that are out there. Definitely, like Mark that kind of mentioned in the first 90 days of the war, particularly the first, I'd say 45 to 60, it was extremely close. The Russians performed actually extremely well. They came very, very close to achieving a decisive victory against Ukraine. But the Ukrainians, and I think this is where some of those narratives, grew, and of course have just kind of taken on a life of their own. But it was a lot, and Aaron alluded to this in one of his answers a little while ago. There was a lot of good initiative and ingenuity upon the Ukrainians at the small unit level that made a difference, right? And so, in a few key battles of a few key areas where it went left instead of going right, and that just made all the difference, in Ukraine then being able to um, withstand the initial shock of the invasion. There's again one of the popular narratives is that, well, the Russians didn't conduct a good initial air campaign, right, to really cripple the Ukraine. They actually did. It's just that kind of shows the resilience, I think, of the Ukrainian military, the ingenuity of a Ukrainian Air Force that was almost totally decimated in the early hours of the full scale invasion to come back, kind of hold the line, as it were. So there is and there's a lot of, I know this is very generalized type of an answer, but the Russians have performed a heck of a lot better than I think most people realize. The Ukrainians have performed well, but as I just mentioned, they've had a little bit more challenges at their senior levels than what is maybe more so admitted, which is kind of why things have unfolded the way that they have. And Ukraine and also Russia is too. They have their own dilemmas, right? They're right now they're both in a set of facing some pretty unique strategic dilemmas that they're both trying to address and get over, so they can move events positively in their way, right? The Russians are trying to move it toward their aims, and Ukrainians are too. So we're definitely at a real inflection point, I think,
So
this year.
we actually have another question on Ukraine. How long is it before Ukraine starts making enough weapons and at appropriate numbers that we can call them indigenous military vehicles, right? Um, Guesses are that it's 18 to 24 months away from self-sufficiency. Is that something that's real? Is that something that would require a certain degree of imported goods? Walk us through the development of Ukraine domestically produced military arms.
Well, like I mentioned, so since the full scale invasion, I want to say that Ukraine, if I'm recalling right off the top of my head, they've doubled their domestic production, right? So they've gone from about around maybe 18 to 20% of their arms and equipment being domestically produced to now they're at 40, or probably now slightly over 40%. Um, and where they are really where they're already self sufficient, of course, is in drones, is in artillery systems now, some other more light vehicles. Um, they're still dependent on Western aid for their more larger platforms, so say like tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, those types of things. But they're trying to have it be more uniform. And by that I mean they're really only looking to a handful of international suppliers, mostly from the Sweden, Finland, a lot of Eastern European, to have common systems. Right now, they have this hodgepodge of just a whole bunch of stuff, which makes logistic support and sustainment hard and difficult. But by trying to standardize the type of vehicles that they have from foreign suppliers, and then even some of those that they're entering into some joint efforts, particularly with Germany, Sweden, I believe Finland, to jointly produce. There's a few others, I believe, to jointly produce some those vehicles, some in Ukraine, some throughout Eastern Europe. But it'll make them more self-sustaining in a sense. I think probably within the next 12 months. So by this time next year, we could probably say that they are self-sustaining, at least as far as their vehicles and other heavy and larger equipment goes. But they're already self-sufficient when it comes to drones, pretty much when it comes to ammunition, when it comes to artillery systems, and some other things that they produce domestically that they do not have to seek foreign assistance on.
No, thank you, Ivan. I would point out because from a lay perspective, it's a little confusing how, if I have five tanks from five different manufacturers, let's say that I want to drive, if I have five cars from five different manufacturers, I can drive all five of them at 35 miles an hour in parallel, right? So it's not entirely intuitive why it is that having a Leopard tank and an Abrams tank and different tanks from different manufacturers, you can't just run them all in the straight line. And it's because
Right.
of the signals communication, it's because of the software integration, it's because of all of the other information systems and learning how to target with different computers and the transferability of troops and all these other kinds of questions that make integrating various different weapon systems produced in different countries more difficult than just driving 5 cars from different manufacturers in a straight line.
Right,
Um,
correct. So, yeah, just real quick, yeah, a lot of those systems are very complex. A lot of the stuff is, proprietary. They need their own supply chains and so forth. So, if you have right 10 different versions of tanks that come from 10 different countries that are all proprietary, that have all their own supply chains and so forth, that's very hard to try to maintain.
yeah.
So yeah, so trying just to go down to a few and definitely domestically produced simplifies all that.
Absolutely. One last Ukraine question, and we really thank you for your time, Ivan. Um,
Yeah, no
so,
problem.
what's your prognosis for the year ahead in terms of losses on land? For example, tanks, they and artillery, they could be vulnerable to drones. You have human beings, right? You talked about the difficulties of matching Russian losses and troop replacements along the I don't know what you want to call it, the militarized zone. Um,
Mhm.
so can you sort of talk about what the expectations are and what that looks like from both an equipment and human standpoint?
Yeah, sure. I think for the remainder of this year, so for the next 6 months, um, we will. Don't think we're going to see a huge change in the operational outlook. And by that I mean I do think that the Russians will uh, uh, be able to make some pretty good headway within the central Donetsk Oblast. Um, I think that at the very least that they will be able to start, but to potentially try to create an operational encirclement of what is likely their main objective, which is, of course, the seizure of the Slovansk Kramatorsk urban conglomerate. This is the pretty much the center of the population, of the economy, of administration, and so forth. So that's in northeast Donetsk province, or sorry, oblast. Um, so that would be about what, as far as territory goes, about probably at least the same amount of territory that they gained last year throughout 2024. I think anything less than that would be seen as a setback for the Russians going into 2026. Um, as far as vehicles and tech goes, we could continue to see continued different innovations when it comes to um, ensuring that FPVs are protected from microwave. So of course they're not susceptible to electronic warfare, but microwave is something that's been recently being introduced onto the battlefield that does interfere with FPVs. So we could see increased efforts to either employ different variations of microwave to stop FPVs, as well as anti-microwave efforts, right, to keep the edge and the advantage with FPVs. But um, as we will continue to see more motorized assaults, because that presents more of a tactical dilemma to FPV operators. Just real quick, it's about five drones to knock out one vehicle. Right, that's about the average right now for on both sides. So if you had only, like, say, one tank and three armored personnel carriers moving, well, you only need 20 drones. But if you have 90 guys on motorcycles, that's 450 drones, right? And definitely motorcycles are moving faster. So that presents a bigger tactical dilemma. So we'll continue to see more motorized assaults uh, on both sides, actually, since the Ukrainians are also too starting to move toward that, and
What?
then conserving their armored ability for when they feel that there is enough of a breakthrough, then that you can employ some type of an armored force.
Now,
Um,
a quick
yeah, go ahead,
question
Aaron.
on that. So like everything, it's trade-offs, right? So if you've got 90
Right.
people doing their Mad Max impression, running around with, as much stuff as they can carry on a motorbike, and you're almost doing the equivalent in World War II when we did airborne drops, and we just sort of sprayed an area with a zillion different people from a zillion different units. And given that, let's just say the Russians don't have a very impressive combat leadership entrepreneurial culture, that when you are putting, hundreds of people in that type of position and they have to reform up units, that you do run the risk of just trapping a whole bunch of isolated small pockets of, 30 people or 60 people that got through of the 150 or 200 that you tried. I mean, that is the trade-off though, ultimately, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's, I was given a very broad, huge, maybe oversimplistic outlook for that. We could definitely go into more detail on that at some future date. But no, yeah, there are trade-offs that you would do that evolve or revolve around the use of these more extensive motorized assaults. But I think that'll continue to be a trend on both sides as they seek to preserve their that armored offensive punching type force, right? For when they think that it'll actually be a success, as opposed to just go down the road and all be taken out by artillery and FPVs. So they're trying to use that a more faster, multiple dilemmaed armored attack, motorized attack that can potentially set the conditions for a successful armored attack. But just like as Aaron said, yeah, there's a lot of trade-off there, a lot of risk. But I think that's a trend that we'll see, continue.
All right. Nourul, I noticed that you had your hand up before.
Yeah,
Um,
so because you were short of time, I
yeah,
had to
yeah.
discontinue with my questions. So my question was like, what about hostages? Like instead of making a deal with Hamas and getting back the hostages, Bibi just goes into another war with Iran, further delaying the return of hostages. Unless this was his plan all along to delay the hostage deal with a new diversion and extend his term as a the PM, and protect himself from being prosecuted for his corruption charges. Now,
My intuition matches yours. I think that in many ways that yes, the timing was good and the intelligence was good in terms of executing this attack from a, let's say, a wider right-wing Israeli national interest, right? Left-wing Israeli national interest might disagree, right? But I would say that in specific, if we look at Netanyahu as a human being, right, because these are human beings making human decisions, I completely agree that the expansion of the war away from Gaza and towards Iran that would lock Israel into that kind of conflict makes it much more difficult to prosecute him on the charges of corruption that led to the anti-Netanyahu protests that you see in the throughout the majority of 2023 when he was trying to stack the judiciary. Um, yeah, completely agree with you.
so basically, he does not care about the hostages at all because he just cares about himself and uses the Israeli people as human shields actually to protect himself. So, and he recently have seen his interview where he actually praises his wife for being so very, very patient, and his son postponing his wedding due to the attacks on the Iran. Anyways,
Right.
that's just one thing I have in mind. My second thing is, why should American people with no health care and drowned in student loans and living on credit cards, literally,
Sure.
pay for a war which is created by a foreign country? Like even Ukraine and Russia is the same thing. Israel and Iran
Sure.
is the recent one.
Sure. And the if you're asking just as a general question, why should the United States support countries that are engaged in war, right? This goes back to the post 1945 discussion of the Bretton Woods institutions, the creation of democratic norms, international governance, right? And all of these elements create a, by and large, more affluent world, a more connected world, and a safer world than previously existed prior to World War II, where you had different imperial cores with different empires, right? If you have one universal empire, which is the United States Empire, right, where the United States patrols the seas and facilitates international trade, you have the creation of things like Mercosur, like the European Union, like uh, Japan's trade networks, India's trade networks that are relatively secure, um, especially if you compare them to the pre-World War II era. That system is worth defending. And the democracies, at least this is the argument, right? And the democracy that the United States has and is trying to slowly influence other countries to adopt, again, questions about whether or not that's an earnest choice, right? Especially when you look at the United States intervention outside of the developed world. But the general thrust of the argument is that the world, at least until let's say 2010, was moving more and more democratic, was moving more and more economically integrated, more less and less towards large scale worldwide confrontations like a World War II, right? So that's the point of defending these countries. I would agree with you that Ukraine fits this template much better than Israel-Iran. I don't think that starting a large scale conflagration between Israel and Iran that upgrades from the proxy war to a direct war is in the United States' interest. And it's not in the interest of this larger mission. But that would be the argument.
Yeah. So if Israel is an ally can do anything that they want, and then America has to just say support whatever they do, even if it's wrong.
Well, no, I mean, look, it's the degree of ally, right? So at the end of the day, Iran has had various allies. The U.S. has had various allies. The Soviets, when they were the Soviets, now the Russians, the Chinese. I mean, these great powers or regional powers, have various allies. Look, I mean, Turkey fought a war against Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a very let's just say sort of an accepted de jure divided area. And, that was one of their allies, right? So you have these conflicts where you have an ally of an ally, and it's a question of how much it's basically a whole bunch of game theory on what do you think the cost that you're going to endure politically, economically, security, militarily, etc. And is that worth it? And do you believe that gambit? Do you believe that chess move is worth the costs? And whether it was Turkey with Armenia and Russia, because they know obviously there's a line in the sand or in the mountain when it comes to Armenia, when it comes to Russia, and Russia made it clear, Nagorno-Karabakh, not our problem. And so then that became an open season, and the Armenians lost that. I'm using it as an example. But then the Turks made it very clear to the Azeris that you don't go beyond Nagorno-Karabakh because we won't support you, and you'll be on your own against the Russians. Because the Russians,
And you can also see the relationship between Turkey and the United States with regards to the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, right?
100%.
And that argument obviously changed in 2017 with Trump's choice. But until that point, right, the United States disagreed with certain Turkish moves against Kurdish militias. So you have
you
you
can
have
see
these kinds
that.
of discussions.
I have no problem being, having Israel as the ally, but it's such an obsession that anything that Israel does, even committing
Right.
war
No,
crimes, you just have to
I would
dismiss it.
no, I would completely agree with you. I think that in particular, you have a large constituency in the United States, which is pro-Israeli to the point where it's part of their religious understanding of the world, right? You have evangelical Christians, you have um, Orthodox Jews who are pro-Zionist, right? There are also evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews that are not pro-Zionist, but let's ignore those for the moment, right? You have the evangelical Christian blocks, you have the Orthodox Jewish blocks, you've got certain groups of others who consider it part of either stabilization in the Middle East from a secular perspective, or something to do with oil from a business perspective, or something about military ingenuity from a military industrial complex perspective.
And I would say the
And
largest.
all of these constituencies have a strong affinity towards Israel, and that's what you see reflected in certain senators like Ted Cruz.
Yep. And I would say this, I think we over-index for assuming that the popular nature of that is actually a larger reason than the hard power realists that we have in America. When it comes to if we have a bridging ally as it's called, international relations, right? Like you generated costs to get that, and you're not going to give that away very easily, right? You're not going to just hand it away either. And so the U.S. has, or Israel, and by the way, it's not just Israel. Egypt is that way too. Saudi Arabia is that way. I mean, we don't maybe have a boisterous population.
Pro-Egyptian lobby.
Yeah, but let's not pretend that the like strategically Saudi Arabia and the Gulf is not actually more important to the United States strategically than even Israel is. And
Agreed.
we might not want to talk about it that way because it hurts people's feelings and vibes, but strategically it's not even close actually because we have we between 20 and 70 ships of one of our most powerful fleets are stationed there. We have all our strategic Air Force assets outside of our deep strike bombers that are there. We have, countless amounts of military and it's national security resources, and that's independent of the energy complex, which is totally separate from that, which is trillions of dollars. So it's us not even close, our support for between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So I think in a lot of ways what we're responding to is um, the much larger media conversation, presence, et cetera. Because I mean, let's just, let's call a spade a spade. So when the Saudis launched their highly successful strikes into Yemen, that was a joke. Um, you didn't hear much from very
From the
many,
U.S. political class. Yeah.
not even political. You didn't hear much from the Europeans. I mean, you didn't hear much from everyone. So we almost have this funky media competition, Boston Red Sox against the Yankees kind of, it's like, let's go out. Oh, the cameras are rolling. Okay, let's march. Okay, oh, the cameras are gone. Okay, let's all go to the food truck together, right? There is a version of that this has turned into a little bit of a performance by all parties that you just don't see in other strategic actors and their behaviors and the U.S. behaviors with them. Look, France has had a extremely heavy colonial presence in Africa. That's like an understatement.
Especially Algeria.
Yeah, and other states economically and also expeditionarily, and the U.S. is and France is obviously a U.S. ally, and the United States would literally defend France with nuclear weapons, right? It's unclear if U.S.
NATO.
Yeah, NATO literally like the kitchen sink. It's unclear like how far the U.S. would defend Israel when it comes to that. I mean, everyone likes to sort of guess and assume. We don't have anywhere near that type of defense architecture that we have with France. And the French will go in and do what the French do, and we won't say much. Well, and by the way, the Chinese and the Russians have their own allies doing the same thing. I mean, look, you had a conflict between Pakistan and India where Pakistan is literally using the newest or the whatever
The newest Chinese planes. Yeah.
really close to the newest generation and newest blocks of the Chinese jets and obviously weapon systems and hammering Indian Air Force assets. And you didn't hear anything. I mean, it was reported on like a match between Chelsea and Man U. That's all it was. It was just like another day at the
Yeah,
office.
I see,
So
guys. I
Yeah.
completely agree with you guys. What you're saying is correct, but the thing is, this is morally so wrong because innocent people are dying because of all this, and there is no prosecution, no accountability, and more suffering. Actually, this has gone too far. Actually,
because we're in the Westphalian state power architecture and nothing's changing that. I mean, that's just the facts, right? When
To
so
deconstruct that,
instead of
there's
just
no international architecture to hold people to justice in a uniform way.
exactly.
right, I know, but we should always like instead of explaining the details and the technicality of this Russia is doing this and Ukraine is doing this, Iran is doing this, and Israel is doing that, we should also maybe pray for a common sense and sanity to prevail between countries and these all these proxy wars should end and innocent people stop dying. This
Don't
is very horrible, actually.
Yeah, don't disagree. I would just say that's just sort of a different focus than what Aaron and I usually do, which is to try and say, hey, this is what you're seeing out of your window. Let's enhance the image so you have a better understanding of it when you're looking out the window. What you do once you pull away from the window and go back to your friends and your family, that's the emotional work that you need to do as an individual and as a community. And that's not something that we can enhance or clarify. That's a personal assessment of how difficult these things are.
All right.
Uh,
Thanks,
Mark?
guys.
Yeah, I have a question on the Israel-Iran conflict, and I take it out, I put it out there to anyone, but maybe particularly Aaron and Ivan, if Ivan is still on. In terms of sorties, have we seen a peak in Israeli sorties against Iran? And in a more general sense, have they taken out most of what they've wanted to take out, or is this continuing?
Yeah, we don't know that, and the Israelis are not sharing that, and likely would barely share it with the U.S., which is probably one of the issues that the U.S. has in engaging, because the U.S. has a extremely advanced Air Force targeting approach. I mean, I would say absurdly advanced. And the U.S. is typically, and the Israelis, let's just say, have a much more dynamic entrepreneurial targeting approach. And so those are in conflict just by design, right? Forget about all the personalities and backgrounds and how you got here and friction between leaders and all that stuff. So I would say the Israelis have a structural limit in that they only have 14 air refuelers, right? And those 14 air refuelers can keep basically a squadron. And by the way, most air forces in the world have much smaller squadrons than the United States has, right? The U.S. has 30, typically 24 to 30 jet squadrons and wings that are in the 70s to 90s. The Israelis have about two-thirds that size. So those 14 air refuelers can keep somewhere between a squadron, maybe two squadrons flying continuously, every day. So that becomes their rate limiting factor at scale. So can they keep up more than, and let's say most of their strike platforms have, probably a realistic limit of two flights a day. So they can probably keep about 100 sorties a day up. But the issue is this, like when you have some large shock event like they did in the first 72 hours, right? The Iranians aren't little robots that put little GPS trackers on their baseball caps and walk around, right? Like they are basically going to go to ground, and not just go to ground, they're going to get diffusive, right? So everyone's going to take anything that they believe is important, meaningful, that could be a target, and they're going to just not spread it. They're going to spread it out horizontally, and then they're going to bury it vertically where they can. And so that means the ability for Israel to target what you might say are highly valuable strategic assets it's just going to plummet. And so that's why I think what's going on is the Israelis are shifting to trying to degrade, you'd call it sort of the generic Iranian military capacity, like the Guards Corps and their military, conventional capacity. And my take is that's pretty much where the Israelis are going to stay focused on. And then whenever they get lucky, or, the Iranians get sloppy, and they can take out a particular target of opportunity that's actually strategic, they will. But those will be more onesie twosies for probably for good, and that's going to force a dilemma on the Israelis, which is they have all this air power. Well, but the Iranians know that, and the Iranians are going to be probably pretty effective at burying this in either cities and complex areas, very diffusive approaches, and that's going to force the Israelis to have to go to ground and actually put resources large scale. And I think that's the dilemma that the Israelis won't cross because they don't want to be in a significant intelligence special operations on the ground war in Iran. That just doesn't that they're not built for that. And the Iranians are actually in some ways built for that. So that would actually confer, I think, over time an advantage for the Iranians. So I think that's where this sort of sorts its way out. I do believe, and this is going to be the big question, is will the Israelis give up the advantage they have in Western Iran and that they've been able to suppress, it's called SED, suppress enemy air defenses. They've been able to suppress all those air defenses. Are they going to give up that advantage? Or are they going to use that as a sanctuary for operations? I think that's going to be the big question. And to be honest, the way that we've seen over time, BB and this government sort of wing things, they probably haven't really figured that out. And I think you've seen this over and over again where they sort of act and then decide if it works, and then if it does, maybe reinforce it, and then if that doesn't work, then they go in another direction or they stop. And I think that loop is what Israel is going to be stuck with, I think, for a while. Does that make sense, Mark? Oh, you're there,
Yeah,
Mark.
yeah, no, I have to unmute him because he's not.
Aaron, I'm on mute. I've been silenced. I can't say anything.
Oh no, you weren't silenced by design. It was an accident.
The powers that be took over, Mark.
Yes, exactly.
You were
Yes.
canceled. We were designed it around you. No, I'm joking.
Okay, so it's basically we don't know. It's a top. I would imagine the American government knows exactly
No?
how many sorties. No, I mean,
no, how many sorties? Sure. How
Yeah.
effective the
That was
sorties were?
that was my question. That was my first question. Anyway,
Yeah. But remember, sorties don't matter if you don't have BDA. It's just
If you
like
don't have what?
it's like if you don't have bombing damage assessment, right? If you don't know what.
Well, that's true, and that's also what the U.S. would be able to know that very at least rather well with satellite imagery.
I mean, that's giving you just a couple dimensions, right? That's not telling you because
Sure,
you
it's
don't.
not everything. It's not
Yeah.
everything. No, of course
It's just not. I mean, you're doing a lot of guesswork, and humans tend to have a lot of confirmation bias, and so you tend to overestimate effectiveness pretty dramatically, actually. Um, so that, I mean, that's where this is a lot more the question is, I mean, how sophisticated is the Israeli Air Force's battle management approach? I've always argued they have an enormous amount of entrepreneurs. I think everyone in the Middle East is that way. They tend to be that way. When they're in the field, just because of the history, the topography, the way of the fight. But they're not the most, let's say, engineered management organization in the history of the world. And I think I think we overestimate that with the Israelis substantially, actually.
Mark, I believe you also have a question in the chat about Iranian disintegration.
Yeah, but I want to give anyone else a chance because I just asked a question. Does anyone else have any other questions? Give them. I don't want to monopolize the airways.
I don't see anything. I don't see anything in the chat. There were some questions that were being asked earlier that I answered in time. So I think you're good to go.
Okay. I'm obviously much less informed about Iran than you are, but when you mentioned about the possibility, in a vague sense, the possibility of Iran breaking up. And my first reaction would be, or was, I disagree with that. I don't think they're, I think it's less than what you think. I mean, nation states are very strong. Iran has been either an empire or a nation state for, but how long? Does it go back 5,000 years?
Something like that.
Yeah. Um, they're not going away.
No,
They, you
no,
know,
I'm not saying that Iran would go away.
no, no,
I
no.
think
Okay,
there's
well, yeah. But so that's one thing, and so I also don't know the percentage of Persians in of the population in Iran. So could you take me what your thinking is
sure.
about your why
So
your
percentages, it's relatively easy to give. Persians are roughly 60% of the country. Azeri are about 17% of the country. Kurds are probably around 6 to 8% of the country. Lur also 6 to 8% of the country, although Lur tend to be very Persophile. Um, and there are other ethnicities like minority Turks, the Turkish tribes that are not Azeri, like the Qashqai, for example. Arabs are about 2 to 3%. Um, but they're very concentrated, and where they're concentrated, there happen to be large oil deposits.
Mhm.
Um, so you have these different groups. I was looking for the map and I couldn't find it. It was in one of my earlier presentations that showed the collapse of Iran between the end of World War One and 1921, when Reza Shah Pahlavi sort of united the country in the next 3 years, right? By 1924, Iran was reunited. But you had 4 or 5 other countries that broke off from Qajar Persia that were reunited under Pahlavi Iran. So there's this history of 5,000 years of Persian civilization, and that's entirely right. But the Persian civilization doesn't necessarily always control the same core regions um, outside of Fars, which is um, tell me if you can see the red pointer here.
Yes.
So that's Fars region where Persians are from. So
Yeah,
Persians
Pers.
always,
Yes.
yeah. So Persians always managed to control this region. Whether or not they could control other regions effectively was a question of alliances and power. In particularly, the northwestern region, where Azeri predominate and Kurds predominate, tends to be an area that they struggle to control unless they had the support of those Turkish groups. We're talking about the last 10 centuries, so recent history. Um, but in order to control those areas, you needed the assistance of those groups. Sometimes they were identified as Kizilbash, sometimes they were identified as Tatars, sometimes they were identified as Kurchi, sometimes they were identified in various different guises and groups, but these were all Turkish people who speak what today we call Azeri. Um, there's the point that Azeri are pretty well integrated into Iranian identity, which is fair. And for example, Ali Khamenei is half Azeri or full Azeri, depending on who you ask. Um, so it's not as if the Azeri want necessarily to split, but we don't have to go back that far in history to see when this was mobilized. We pointed out that in the period prior to Reza Shah's unification in 1924, of all the territories, the Azeri were independent. And in 1946, there was an attempt by the Soviets to create an Azeri state, which was defeated by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, supported by the United States, as it was sort of a communist satellite state, the same way that Poland was a communist satellite state and Eastern Germany was. Right. So now, in those cases, of course, those states remained communist until the fall of the Soviet Union. In this case, the Soviet Union was not able to project its power strongly enough to prevent the Iranian army from retaking these areas. But so it's not out of the picture that the country could devolve into these ethnic regions because of the history. And at that same time, by the way, the Kurds broke away as the Republic of Mahabad, which was similarly incorporated by Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1946, and they had declared independence with Soviet assistance. So it's not out of entire impossibility that it would occur, but I agree with you as a general matter that nation states tend to have very formalized structures, and we talked about how complex the bureaucratic structure is in Iran that would make this unlikely.
Yeah, and I would say one thing though. My thesis is that if the central state was weak enough, the business mafias, which do control the economy in Iran, and there's huge tension basically between, we could just call it the ruling authorities and the business mafias, that the business mafias, to protect themselves, would become armed, and then that would lead to a Hobbesian, all versus all fight. And then that's the type of disintegration that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sort of like, a Mongol, elimination of state boundaries and territories, but more of a Balkan style, Yugoslavia of the 1990s, mafia states, mafia sub-states, statelets, this kind of clan blend of, mafia clan, ethno subnational type structures, right? Which basically makes Iran effectively a modern semi-failed state at that point. Like that's the version that I'm describing, that if you had a collapse of central authority, that you run the risk of generating, because those mafia clans are massive in Iran, infinitely larger than the Russian ones. The Russians ones became fully modernized, right? I mean, they're public companies now. In a lot of ways, their mafia in Russia has been made a more classic sort of illicit subterranean mafia. It's not a it's not a corporate economic mafia, whereas in Iran it is. And
Yeah.
obviously the sanctions regime in the last 2 3 decades has transformed that, for obvious reasons.
There,
So kind
there,
of,
there, yeah,
so
there are two last questions. And then we're going to close this out. Um, so one question from is why did Azerbaijan stay quiet when Tabriz was bombed? Tabriz being the capital of uh, Azerbaijan region in Iran. Also, is it true that Azeri in Iran think that Azerbaijan is the Republic of Azerbaijan is a mountain people and therefore not on the level of Iranian Azerbaijanis? Um, I would say that these two are very much related. And Azerbaijan is not a country where you have freedom of the press. So Azerbaijan, the country's political philosophy is the Aliyev political philosophy,
Well,
and they
for
are afraid of an expansion of Iranian power into the Republic of Azerbaijan, which is why they maintain one of the reasons why they maintain their alliance with Israel, one of the reasons why they are very cold as concerns the Iranian government, and why they generally don't object. It's also possible that Azerbaijan did some coordination with Israel with regards to these strikes. It's not clear. The second part is that Iranian Azerbaijanis, as we've talked about, are relatively integrated into the Iranian world and see the people of the Republic of Azerbaijan as being a different Turkic group who stole the name Azerbaijan from the Iranian region, right? That this region was originally called Shirvan, and therefore it's actually a different Turkic people. They should be united, but if they are united, it should be under a South Azerbaijani administration, an Iranian Azerbaijani administration. It should not be under the Aliyev administration of the Republic of Azerbaijan. So I have one last question, and that's from Greg. So Greg's question from the chat is, what are the chances of the current system surviving post-war? I assume this is referring to Iran. Is there an Egyptian model possible? And I would say the chances of this government surviving post-war are very high. I would put that in the at least 80%, 90% range. Um, and is an Egyptian model possible? I'm not sure what that's referring to. If the question is that the country would be subservient to the United States, would this
No, I mean, I think he might mean General Monster, creating that's my generalized Hobbesian term for a super general that runs a place with an iron fist.
so
Um,
a Sisi style? Okay,
yeah,
got it.
Craig, please confirm if that's what you mean by that, because that's how I interpret it.
if that's the question, Iran is certainly susceptible to militaristic rule. Reza Shah Pahlavi was not from a noble family that would have been allowed to rule Iran. He seized power militarily, and declared a dynasty afterwards. So, and I would say the same is true of the Qajar, and before them the Afsharids, and that's within the last 300 years. So, it would be very surprising to me if a military state were not the outcome of a divided Iran. And I agree with Aaron that it would probably be military somehow coordinated with the business thugs.
Yeah, sorry, I got stuck. I only got. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I meant this that military would take over, and then at least it could have been a secular state without ideology of Satan and Israel and the U.S. That would be the best outcome.
Well, maybe. So I think a thing we don't realize is a militarized state that survives a deconstruction will now make their Hobbesian survival the highest priority, and they won't be constrained by funny things like religion or culture or ethnicities or blah, 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 right? Modern life. They're going to look at it as a binary live or die, which means their likelihood is to recognize that a nuclear program might be a bridge too far, but a bridge that is not too far is a massive chemical, biological, ballistic force which you can't stop in the modern world. I mean, you can only do that through treaty and through Russian and Chinese and U.S. arm twisting, and so there's the risk of that type of state being constructed.
Yeah,
So
but Sisi, I know there is a risk, but also if you look at the Egyptian model, Sisi is not in that direction, and if the sanctions will be removed, Persia is much more richer country than Egypt.
No, agreed. But here's the thing: Sisi inherited the de jure national security structure that Egypt has built, in the post-Sadat Begin kind of world, right? So he's not disrupting that security arrangement. There is not that type of security arrangement in Iran. That's the problem, is there isn't that. So my thesis is General Monster then has to construct that, and that's not necessarily a relationship that is probably going to fit anyone's satisfactory level, whether regional actors or global actors. Maybe China, because China always finds a way to make it economically viable. But every other actor, they're going to be looking to have an arm's length, stiff arm type relationship, because they're going to realize, or they're going to recognize that, especially if their state became that destabilized, no one came to their aid, their so-called allies, and whatever that means. And so, those will be the lessons learned, right? So that is I think that's the one risk of what you might call the extreme militarized rule in Iran versus, let's say, you might say the nice modern militarized rule in Iran, which I think is probably what a bunch of people are hopeful for.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand. I agree. This could be even worse. Yeah.
On that lovely note, let's close out today. It could always be worse. So, so hopefully, you've enjoyed your time here. Where's the?
Oh, and I want to thank Ivan and Nourul for fantastic contributions, and Ivan, really appreciate your time here today also, and I know it's valuable with all the stuff you're doing.